Did you know this was RuneScape's first world map? From Lumbridge, to the Elflands, to Zaya. RuneScape's world map has evolved perhaps more than any other game map in history. It's recognized by its seemingly endless seas, mostly useless icons, nostalgic straight edges at the end of the world, in those perfectly defined chunks. What also defines it is that it rarely stays the same for very long, sometimes changing multiple times per week. Have you ever wondered why certain parts of the map are the way that they are, even if they make no sense being that way today? Well, the changes to the map over the years tell a story that even the most seasoned veterans of the game may not know. In the game's first year, maybe both the most iconic and yet most unrecognizable of them all. January 4th, 2001, the date RuneScape was first released, just 23 and a half short years ago. There were only 6 quests in the game. Varrock West Bank, formerly known as the Bank of Varrock, was the first and only bank in the entire game, and it only accepted coins. The Black Knight north of the Wizard's Tower was the most fearsome foe in the game at a harrowing level 46, and bread, meat, chicken, and spinach rolls were the only food in the entire game. Outside the game on this same date, baseball legend Michael Jordan scored his 30,000th career point in the NBA, just 5 short years after teaming up with the Toon Squad to save us all from the Monstars. AOL was kind enough to offer 1,000 free hours of high-speed dial-up internet up to a roaring 50 kilobits per second. Miss Congeniality sat at number 2 at the US box office, and, swearing me mum, the Bob the Builder theme song sat atop the UK song charts. No, seriously, you can't make this up. Perhaps Andrew Gower had that song stuck in his head as he gave us our first official world map. This probably looks familiar to you as we are introduced to some iconic places like Lumbridge, Varrock, Barbarian Village, the Wizard's Tower, Draynor Manor, and Edgeville under its original name, Ghost Town. We even got the Edgeville Dungeon and Varrock Sewers as our first 2 dungeons. But what may stand out as particularly unusual would be this entire additional area of Eastern Varrock. Player-owned houses. Coming soon? If by soon, Andrew meant 282 weeks later, instance, and in an entirely different location, then that makes perfect sense. Otherwise, why was this here? Well, remember earlier when we learned that the Bank of Varrock only accepted GP and not items? Well, items were originally supposed to be stored in your player-owned house instead of the bank. And to be clear, these weren't instance houses. The intention was that players would own actual real estate in the game. That's right, Andrew Gower created the metaverse 2 decades before Mark Zuckerberg. If player-owned houses had actually been released like this, can you imagine their value today in RuneScape 3? If useless cosmetic hats are worth nearly 120 bill today, then actual useful real estate in the game from 2001 would probably be into the trillions, and the street value would have no doubt been far more valuable than anything in the metaverse, even without accounting for 20 years of inflation. At the time, it's unlikely that Andrew ever could have predicted how much the game would have exploded in popularity, so this limited housing project was probably feasible at the time with its smaller player base. And just like in the real world, there were houses of all shapes and sizes, and even some apartments or flats proposed as well. Basic 3x4 tile homes, 4x4 homes with a second floor and a 2x4 garden, and 6x6 houses with a second floor and 2x6 garden. There were also a couple of uniquely shaped 4-story buildings, likely meant to be the original clan halls. With PvP being enabled everywhere for everyone, the housing district likely would have been an all-out war zone, but rest assured that those of us who were perpetually broke in Classic had some more affordable spaces we could call home as well. There were several apartment buildings filled with floors and floors of 3x3 tile flats. Not ideal, but at least we could have had a small place to call home to. And to think, since the release of construction in 2006, just 1k GP will now get you a private 8x8 parlor with an 8x8 garden in bustling downtown Remington. January 19th, 2001. Strangely enough, the first ever update to the game was quietly released while this guy was president of the United States, but Jagex forgot to actually announce it until this guy became president. Whoops. In other words, it took Jagex a couple of days before they made a news post on the 21st announcing their first ever content update that quietly released on the 19th. Not only did Count Draynor wake up from his slumber and finally unlock the front doors of Draynor Manor to go find some prey, but the citizens of Kharid also opened their city to the public. However, the Kharid Gate didn't exist yet, so the only way to access the city was to walk all the way around to the north and down, and there wasn't even a bank there yet, so you really had to commit to it just to visit the far east of the map. Now, back on the far west side of the map, we also found out that Draynor Manor wasn't just the name of a cheap wedding venue that serves mystery chicken and aesthetically looks straight out of the 1980s. It was actually a proper haunted house with a witch,
Here's a witch,
a skeleton, a vampire, and apparently this guy who turned people into chickens in his quest to find a realm that came with its own seizure warning. Of course, his Ernest the Chicken quest gave us our first introduction and tour of Draynor Manor. And before Morning's End Part 2's three-dimensional light puzzle that terrorized us in 2005, there was the two-dimensional door puzzle in Draynor Manor's basement. I know it's easy to cruise through this quest today with guides, plugins, and vague memories of having done the puzzle countless times before, but back then, we didn't have any of that. This was legitimately a pretty difficult puzzle for kids, and the reward was a whopping 300 coins, which really was a tremendous amount of money back then. January 28th, 2001. The UK shocked the world when its most treasured theme song fell to number 20 on the charts, outclassed by Limp Bizkit's Rollin' at number 1. What was once a national treasure now merely sat in the middle of the pack of the UK's top 40 charts. Pour out a cold one for Bob. Anyway, it turns out that Ernest the Chicken came before the excellent town of Draynor Village. You can rest easy now knowing that Draynor Village was named after Draynor Manor because on this day, we saw the release of Draynor Village in the Vampire Slayer quest. Those of us who have ventured east of the River South know that vampires are not easy to defeat, requiring great effort and concentration, so we needed to come prepared for a fight. Thankfully, his crossing of the River Salve severely weakened his powers and made him vulnerable to garlic and a stake through the heart. To get a stake, we of course had to find Dr. Harlow. While you can reliably find him at his favorite pub at the Blue Moon Inn today, we originally had to venture to the most northeastern corner of the map to find him at the Jolly Boar Inn. With that garlic, stake, and hammer in hand, we were finally ready to tell Count Draynor to sit. February 5th, 2001. The game had been out for a full month now, so it was about time for its first dungeon expansion, to the Varrock sewers. With that came a new fearsome boss to dethrone the Black Knight as the highest level monster, the spine-chilling Moss Giant. Its prize drop, none other than the spinach roll, a powerful strength-boosting food at the time. It was previously only available through some specific dialogue with Wizard Treyborn during the Demon Slayer quest. With this expansion also came the deadly red spider, and therefore access to strength potions from the apothecary in Varrock, since the Herbaler skill didn't exist yet. Before this update, the only reliable way to boost your strength level was a +2 boost from beer. This update brought strength potions, and now a repeatable method of obtaining spinach rolls, as two superior alternatives that required traveling deep into this endgame dungeon. Strength potions only boosted your level +3 at level 1 denied strength. At every 10 level milestone, it would go up by an additional +1, so +5 at level 20 and up to +12 at level 90. Alternatively, the spinach roll gave a flat +5 boost regardless of strength level, so not a bad alternative at a lower level. Today in Old School, it's pretty easy to run past all the enemies to get to the back of the sewer to grab those red spider eggs, but in Classic, you would get locked into combat and unable to retreat for 3 rounds every time you were attacked. And keep in mind that teleporting didn't exist at all until May, so you also had to budget enough food to make your way out of the dungeon alive with all your spoils as well. And don't forget, you also needed a Limport route, which could only be obtained deep into the Edgeville dungeon. In context, it was actually pretty difficult to make a single strength potion at this point in time. And speaking of danger, February 13th, 2001. After completing 8 dangerous quests, we had finally garnered enough influence across the small world to get some well-deserved and long overdue recognition at none other than the Champions Guild. Before quests were officially tracked on a formal list anywhere in-game, you just had to roam aimlessly around the world talking to everyone until you started a quest and manually kept track of your progress to completion. The unofficial system was aptly named Influence, and to enter the guild, you needed the max influence at any given time. This haphazard system eventually ran its course, and in May was replaced with the official quest point system. Eventually, it also locked in the requirement of 32 quest points that we know today, but not quite yet. What's interesting is that to use the Champions Guild door in either direction, you had to have all quests completed. This meant if you logged out inside the guild and Jagex sprung a new quest on you overnight, then you could be locked inside with no way out. To fix this, they installed a one-way emergency escape ladder upstairs that led you safely outside. But it's too bad you didn't have a real emergency escape ladder of your own when you stayed up playing for 2 days to get into the guild and forgot all about your big dinner plans on the 14th. February 28th, 2001. Draynor Jail, the place where boys became men, and also the place where boys became women, apparently. Children all over the world completing the Prince Ali rescue quest learned a very valuable lesson in this building, that if you enable an addict, you too can influence them to do your bidding. This was the second released quest in a row, right after the Vampire Slayer quest that taught us the importance of giving beer to an alcoholic to get what we want. This is the one that started to engrave the pattern into our impressionable young minds that Jagex would go on to enforce over and 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 over again. March 17th, 2001. What better day to continue with that theme than St. Paddy's Day? Of course, brewing didn't get added to the game for several more years, but we did gain the ability to make wine alongside the release of the Cook's Guild. Although it would have been very fitting to be able to make some corned beef and hash, I'm afraid it wasn't quite so on the nose. What a coincidence that they chose this specific day of all days to introduce the ability to make our own alcohol though. Since this was only the beginning of the player's journey with alcohol, you could only drink wine in two separate halves. That may sound familiar because chronologically, this is the first tradable item released that would go on to be discontinued, but not removed from the game. What we also got on this date was our first batch of real food. We finally had more to eat than just bread, meat, and those mysterious appendages that seem to fall off of moss giants. We now had the ability to bake Redberry pies, meat pies, and apple pies. Keep in mind the context here that the fishing skill didn't exist yet, so the only way to get relatively high healing food was to go through the relatively lengthy process of making pies, which have to be eaten in two separate halves. Much like making your own strength potions, it was a lot of work, but a great opportunity to make some serious GP. High effort, high reward. April 6th, 2001. We got our first ever major area expansion of the game. The map increased in size by about 50% with the release of Asgarnia, and more importantly, with Thurgo. Now, with this release also came the warming of relations between King Rold's Kingdom of Misthalin and Ceramic Vars' Kingdom of Asgarnia. As such, they were now willing to open their borders to each other, and both commerce and visitors could freely flow through the peaceful Barbarian village. Also of note is that the two kingdoms... I'm sorry, but does anyone find it funny that as soon as the Cook's Guild released the recipe for Redberry pie to its guild members, that just mere weeks later, Thurgo, the supposed last surviving member of the Redberry pie-loving Imkando dwarves, risked the extinction of his kind by coming out of hiding, and it just so happened that one of the White Knights' most fiercely loyal and reliable squires just happened to lose his master's sword? Tell me that's not a coincidence. Is Thurgo a fraud? Did Thurgo launch an elaborate plot to steal the knight's sword just to swindle an adventurer out of a Redberry pie? Is there a good reason why someone shaped like a thumb would be able to smell a pie all the way from across the map? I don't know. I'm just asking questions. Anyway, what were we talking about? After some successful peace talks, the kingdoms of Misthalin and Asgarnia opened their borders to each other. We, as citizens of Misthalin, now had access to our ancestral homeland of Asgarnia through this massive map expansion with such iconic places as the city of Falador, Port Sarim, Remington, Ice Mountain, the Dwarven Mines, Goblin Village, the Monastery, and the Asgarnia Ice Dungeon. The Bank of Varrock even opened a second branch and chose West Falador as the perfect spot to open its first ever expansion. Ice Giants surpassed their mossy cousins as the new strongest monster in the game, nestled among aggressive ice warriors in the back of the remote Asgarnia Ice Dungeon. That's a very long way away from Falador's West Bank. Now, you also probably again noticed that, like Varrock, the eastern half of Falador had also originally been set aside for the future player-owned house project, including a massive mansion. What's cool is that these buildings are all generally still there even to this day and have actually recently been repurposed. The smaller houses did end up being used as part of the construction skill through the Mahogany Homes minigame. The mansion, of course, eventually became the new home to the party room after Party Pete was evicted from Sears Village in one of the very last updates of RuneScape 2, prior to the old school snapshot of the game from August 2007, but for the time being, the area remained inaccessible. Later this month, the world would see the release of an animated blockbuster film, Shrek, a movie about an angry guy in a swamp who just wanted to be left alone, but got interrupted by an unwanted guest. That plot feels vaguely familiar for some reason. May 2001. We didn't get any changes to the map this month, but we did get some major updates that we need to talk about. The good magic and evil magic skills were consolidated into a single magic skill, and among many other spells, finally brought teleportation into the game. Obviously, it just became a lot easier to travel across the map and escape from deep dungeons. We also saw the expansion and renaming of the limited tailoring skill into the more comprehensive crafting skill. Furthermore, this month also introduced Goblin Mail into the game. Many of you may have some fond memories of picking up that drop from a slain goblin and excitedly attempting to try to wear it as your first ever armor upgrade, only to be met with this message: that armor is too small for a human. Well, believe it or not, upon release, this goblin armor was originally unequipable, but somehow assigned unbelievably high defensive stats. I think you know where this is going. There was actually a bug that allowed you to equip it, and it still partially works to this day. It was very simple, actually. All you had to do was grab a Draynor Manor cabbage and... Sorry, I thought I told my mom no phone calls while I'm playing RuneScape, but does she ever listen? No.
Ham, just pause your game for a bit. Sheesh, you'll be fine.
Mom, you can't pause RuneScape.
Well, you'll just have to turn it off then, because I need to talk to Grandma.
No, I am not about to play solitaire and Minesweeper for 4 hours while you talk to Grandma.
All right, that's it, young man. You're grounded. I'm shutting off your game.
Okay guys, I think we're in the clear. She only unplugged the printer. June 11th, 2001. Although reasonable arguments could be made whether the magic and crafting skills were released in January or in May, this day in June brought our first indisputable new skill, fishing, and with that new skill came an associated map expansion, a trend we'll continue to see with many new skills in the future. What better way to introduce this brand new fishing skill than to release the game's very first island? Still to this day in old school RuneScape, this dock remains the only place on the free-to-play map where lobster and swordfish can be caught, other than the deep wilderness and Corsair Cove. That means there are potentially children today testing out the non-member version of the game, experiencing the same things we did back in the early 2000s. Fishing levels? Nice. Fire please. Selling fire 10k. Also don't forget at this point in time, there are only 2 banks in all of RuneScape. Varrock West Bank and Falador West Bank. That's it. There is no Draynor Bank or Falador East Bank. There's also no Certers and Draynor yet. So to catch the best 2 pieces of food in the game, you had to catch a full inventory, head to the boat, agree to a cavity search, pay the fare, board the boat back to Port Sarim, walk all the way up to Falador West Bank, walk all the way back, board the boat back to Karamja, and get back to the dock to start fishing again. You could sacrifice some inventory slots to teleport to Falador if you somehow accumulated enough runes to level up magic that high of a level and somehow had enough money to afford those elusive law runes. To add even more time, if you chose to cook on a local fire please, don't forget that Cook X didn't exist yet, so you had to manually click every piece of raw food on the fire and pray that you didn't burn too many. Power leveling fishing wasn't quite as prevalent then as it is today, mainly because food was very valuable at the time. With all this effort, you could have made some good money here providing the food for the various clan wars going on all over the map. If you were patient or wealthy enough to obtain a good amount of food, you may have been prepared to face the greatest horror that Gillinor had ever faced to date, the Lesser Demon, located within the Karamja Volcano Dungeon. While the standard drop table seems pretty disappointing by today's standards, to be fair, it hasn't changed much in 23 years, it was pretty good back then. However, the big drop wouldn't be released for another month and a half. The Rune Medhelm. One last game changer to discuss here is that there really weren't a lot of great reliable moneymakers at this point in time, especially not for lower levels. Everything changed on this day. Jagex actually really released an unlimited money printer that still works to this day, and you can easily verify this on the wiki if you don't believe me. At the banana plantation on Karamja, Luthus is willing to hire you to pick 10 bananas, and he will actually pay you 30 GP. The elites don't want you to know this, but you can actually do this an infinite amount of times, and he will continue to pay you 30 GP every time. So if you wanted to get your hands on that powerful adamant battle axe, all you had to do was pick 1400 bananas, and you had the most powerful weapon in the entire game. And that moneymaker couldn't have arrived at a better time. If you thought these guys were famous for highway robbery, Kharid built a gate into its border fence and actually had the audacity to charge a 10 GP toll. Luthus's generosity as an equal opportunity employer was the only thing preventing the goblins of Lumbridge from being entirely wiped out. Needless to say, he was persona non grata at the local Humans Against Monsters cult meetings. July 12th, 2001. With about a month between relevant updates here, Jagex wasn't exactly rolling around at the speed of sound. Or maybe they were until they discovered the Chow Garden. Where even was that place anyway? Some kind of black hole? Nah, that would just be ridiculous. Although, the surface of the RuneScape map didn't change on this date, we did get 2 new areas worth at least mentioning. The new quote-unquote prayer guild was added to the top floor of the monastery. With it came monk's robes and holy symbols alongside silver crafting. According to the news post, mining silver required level 99 mining, but that was just a 3.5 month late April Fool's prank. On this day, we also saw the release of the second tradable item that would later go on to be discontinued, the Disc of Returning. This item provided the only path to visiting a place called the Blackhole that didn't require any rule breaking. The Blackhole was a place where banned players were moved by Jagex. Some players were intentionally trying to get temporary bans just to see if the rumored black hole was real and what it was like. To resolve the player's curiosity, the Disc of Returning was added as a means for rule-abiding players to visit the black hole with a safe way of returning to the main game. Innocent visitors to this realm were often scammed by the actual rule breakers into dropping their Disc of Returning, thus trapping them and offering them no means of escape. Eventually, this scam led to the removal of the black hole altogether, and the discs were no longer obtainable. July 26th, 2001. Speaking of discontinued ideas, on this date, player-owned houses were removed from both Varrock and Falador and replaced with new eastern banks in both cities. Unfortunately for him, Mark Zuckerberg clearly didn't learn this same lesson with his cancellation of the failed metaverse. Andrew Gower at least had the good sense to retreat and regroup without wasting $46 billion along the way. With the removal of player-owned houses also came the ability to store items besides just coins in the 4 banks that existed. That's right, as an apology for giving up on player-owned housing for the time being, Jagex added 2 new branches of the Bank of Varrock, where the housing developments once stood. Jagex also slightly changed the shape of the map everywhere and added some additional icons. In Varrock, their housing development was removed altogether. In Falador, most of the buildings remained, including the mansion that would eventually go on to become the party room, and the little houses that would eventually go on to be used for construction training in Old School via the Mahogany Homes minigame. Also, just a quick fun story involving that mansion from Classic. While I was a fresh noob exploring the map in game, I happened to go upstairs in this mansion on the right world at the right time. I intercepted a drop trader and ended up with 3 Rune 2-handed swords, a strength amulet, and a couple of other mind-blowing upgrades for a total noob who couldn't even use any rune items yet. Must have been a terrible day for the other guy, but what was he going to do, report me while he was breaking the rules? Eventually, I had to sacrifice one of those swords to retrieve a Rune full helm that had been scammed away from my brother. Needless to say, he still owes me to this day, even after 2 decades. That's right, not gonna let you get away with that one.
You know me, the fighting freak Knuckles, and we're at Pumpkin Hill. You ready? I ain't gon' let it get to me, I'm just gon' creep down in Pumpkin Hill. I got to find my lost piece. I know that it's here, I can sense it in my feet. The great emerald's power allows me to feel. I can't see a thing, but it's around somewhere. I'm gonna hold my head.
August 13th, 2001. Before this update, players had the choice to opt in or out of PvP everywhere. Some players had a hard time deciding, trying to go back and forth, even though they were only given a limited number of times. Eventually, as a compromise, Jagex just casually doubled the size of the map overnight. That's right, half of the map was a safe zone, and the other half was a PvP zone. Can you imagine if they decided to maintain this equal ratio forever, and just continue to expand the PvP zone to the west? Regardless, this massive expansion, infamously known as the Wilderness, was, and still is, an area dedicated to PvP, with both great risk and great reward. It's a very delicate ecosystem. Looters, skillers, and monster hunters are hunted by garbage PKers. Garbage PKers are hunted by experienced PKers. Experienced PKers are hunted by skilled PKers. Skilled PKers are hunted by small teams, who are hunted by large teams, who are hunted by large clans who also war with other large clans. If the bottom of the food chain didn't exist, the rest might not either. Let's talk a bit about exactly what rewards the Wilderness had to offer back then and put them in context, because they probably won't impress you by today's standards. First and most obvious would be the Rune Rocks located in level 45 of the Wilderness. This of course meant that you could attack players here that were as much as 45 combat levels below your own, but also that players here as much as 45 combat levels higher than your own could also attack you. That of course meant this was a very dangerous place. but the potential wealth was nearly unlimited. While some rune items were released a month prior, this was when the rest of rune armor and weapons were made available via the smithing skill. Of course, no one had the level yet to make the coveted rune two-handed sword, but its raw power was technically possible to attain now. As such, these rune ores were extremely valuable, but could only be mined this deep into the wilderness, and only by the very best miners in the game. Just barely south of there lies the Lava Maze, home of the Muddy Chest, which you could open for great rewards if you were lucky enough to receive a Muddy Key dropped from a Chaos Dwarf between levels 30 and 40 in the wilderness. That's right. These were the original Laren's keys. Instead of a random loot roll, it was a guaranteed drop of 8 items that would use up a significant chunk of your inventory space. Don't forget that worn equipment was worn out of the inventory rather than a separate equipment menu, so your inventory was now bogged down by your gear and these 8 items. So your food was now limited to escape, and there's no teleporting out, at least not this deep. And the monsters guarding this chest and maze were no joke back then. The ruby could be used to make the Amulet of Strength. The runes were very powerful runes back then and very hard to come by, especially in any significant quantities. Also found within the lava maze were some familiar spawns that are still good moneymakers to this day for low-level accounts and old school. The steel plate body and the earth staff. Even back then, those plate bodies sold for a whopping 1200 GP, which was still quite a lot at the time. These weren't the only valuable spawns in the wilderness though. Just east of the lava maze, the Sapphire House could be found on what we may recognize as the Spider Hill today. Chaos runes could be picked up just south of there. Big bones were released into the game on this day as well and could be found on the ground on the east side of the wilderness to speed up your monotonous prayer grind. Places like the Wilderness Bandit Camp, Dark Warrior Castle, Red Dragon Isle, and Central Wilderness Ruins didn't exist yet, so we'll have to circle back on those spawns and features later on. Just west of the northeasternmost point of the deep wilderness also played home to a new highest level monster in the game, the terrifying Greater Demon, clocking in at a whopping level 87 and offering the drop of a brand new best helmet in the game, the Rune Full Helm. As you can tell, there were a lot of non-PvP activities, resources, and rewards in the wilderness to entice everyone there. This is just how the wilderness has always been, and anyone complaining about being quote-unquote forced into the wilderness today is either ignorant of its origins or aware and disingenuous at best. But fear not, wilderness haters, as you weren't entirely forgotten about on this date either. First, the place known as Ghost Town was renamed to Edgeville. This newly revitalized and resettled town would also claim the 5th ever branch of the Bank of Varrock. These updates made sense to support the new wilderness update. Also, according to the wiki, the Mining Guild was released on this date as well, but I suspect it was actually added with the update on July 26th, since the Mining Guild's Falador entrance was added to the map on one of these two dates, and it would have made more sense for it to be added alongside the removal of player-owned houses from Eastern Falador. At the same time, the East Bank was added right next door. You'll notice that most of the map updates tend to be bunched together in the same area, and I suspect this one was no exception. If you have any evidence or memories suggesting one way or another, please share them in the comments. September 23rd, 2001. We had to get to this depressing month sooner or later, I guess. No jokes or snappy comments this time, so we'll just get right into it. This update brought us the most indisputably iconic quest in the entire history of RuneScape, Dragon Slayer. With that came 3 updates to the world map as well: Melzar's Maze, Port Sarim Jail, and the island of Crandor. And who could forget the ability to wear the most iconic item in the game as a reward, the Rune Plate Body in all its glory. And the release of this quest has a pretty wholesome story. Back in Classic, an NPC could only talk to one player at a time, so when this prolific quest was released, needless to say, there was quite a lot of players all trying to complete the quest at the same time, and it created quite a bottleneck when it came time to talk to Oziak. Instead of a mad dash of players spam clicking to speak to him, they actually queued up in an orderly fashion, and everyone waited their turn. Someone was even kind enough to sell hot dogs to anyone hungry while waiting in line. It reminds me a lot of the task to kill the caged lesser demon at the top of the Wizard's Tower during leagues. Just very wholesome. However, the quest itself was actually quite a bit darker than you may remember. Everyone knows the so-called Goblin house near the Kharid gate. Did you know, canonically, just weeks before the player arrived in Lumbridge for the first time, that house actually belonged to an elderly mage called Lozar, who was one of just 3 survivors of Elvarg's fiery slaughter of the rest of the island's inhabitants. The Goblins launched a failed invasion of Lumbridge, and Lozar was just one of the casualties. Imagine surviving the fiercest dragon on this side of the wilderness ditch, but falling to a bunch of level 2 goblins who new players slaughter to pay a 10 GP toll. Regardless, his house was ransacked and a goblin by the name of Wormbrain stole Lazar's piece of the map. When the authorities arrived, the others scrambled, but Wormbrain was left holding the bag and was sent to Port Sarim jail. The player, of course, retrieves the first map piece from him with the help of some runes or arrows. Elvarg's attack on Crandor was the very same attack that drove Melzar to madness, living out the rest of his days hidden away in his own maze until the player puts him out of his misery to retrieve the second map piece. As for the third map piece from Thalzar, I think the inscription on the chest hidden inside the Dwarven Mines speaks for itself. Here I rest the map to my beloved home. To whoever finds it, I beg of you, let it be. I was honor bound not to destroy the map piece, but I have used all my magical skill to keep it from being recovered. This map leads to the lair of the beast that destroyed my home, devoured my family, and burned to a cinder all that I love. But revenge would not benefit me now, and to disturb this beast is to risk bringing its wrath down upon another land. Eventually, the player avenges all three of them and slays the foul beast Elvarg, the new highest level monster in all of RuneScape. And man, was that the greatest feeling in the world or what? December 8th, 2001. We got the one and only content update smack dab in the middle of a 5-month content drought. Of course, excluding the dropping of pumpkins to celebrate Halloween and dropping of party hats via Christmas crackers to celebrate the birth of self-proclaimed bad guy Billie Eilish. If you thought 2020 and 2021 were slow years for old school RuneScape, those years had everything in comparison to this near half year of almost nothing. Excluding 2 holiday item drops, we got 1 content update and therefore only 1 map change. What changed exactly? Well, for starters, we got a couple of new banks. The first in Kharid, the second in Draynor Village, though that was only one piece of the update to Draynor. The wise old man hadn't quite moved to town just yet, but that doesn't mean we didn't get to first meet some now familiar faces. Before Niles, Miles, and Giles retired to travel the world and ask us to identify a fish for them, these brothers made their fortune in the certificates business. You see, in Classic, there were no such thing as banknotes. If an item wasn't naturally stackable, like arrows, runes, and coins, then each individual item would take up its own full inventory space. This became pretty cumbersome when it came time to trade large quantities of goods because you could only trade 29 or 30 items at a time at most, so to trade a large stack, you would need hundreds or thousands of trades with another player. To get around this, these 3 familiar faces set up a shop here as Certers, who would exchange non-stackable resources for stackable certificates, and vice versa. So instead of trading another player hundreds of times, you could trade them once, and instead trade with the 3 brothers hundreds of times instead, and each one of them had their own specialization. Instead of manually trading a load of iron ore 26,000 tons more than your inventory weighed empty, Giles would take care of that for you, constantly asking for more weight. He was our main man for almost anything you could mine, specifically iron, coal, silver, gold, and mithril. Niles here was our fish expert, willing to be the middleman for both raw and cooked lobsters and swordfish. The best food in the game up to that point. Unless this guy was secretly a Majorat constantly casting ice barrage on the food supply every 20 seconds, then I have no idea how he managed to keep the fish from rotting. All that cooked fish probably made the whole town smell like the microwave at my office after lunch. Miles was our expert on all bars: iron, steel, silver, gold, mithril, Blue Moon, Jolly Boar, Rising Sun, etc. With a job that monotonous, it's no wonder he drank himself blind and couldn't tell the difference between a fish and a bowl. While this was an extremely useful quality of life update, it's a bit of a stretch to call this any significant amount of new content. What exactly was Jagex up to that this was the only update for 5 months? Maybe Jagex employees were too busy having Halo LAN parties at the office. Maybe they were hyper-focused on who on staff could main Fox the best in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Maybe they were investigating Enron. Or maybe, just maybe, they were tirelessly working hard day and night on the single most important update in the history of RuneScape that literally saved our game and the company. What if I told you that RuneScape almost died just a year after the game was released? If you clicked on this video, RuneScape has probably touched your life in some way. So imagine if it had entirely disappeared back in 2002. If you're not a lifelong RuneScape enthusiast like me, it might not seem like such a big deal. But if you know anything about the butterfly effect, you'd know that a world without RuneScape would have been different. So many connections would have never been made, so many life lessons wouldn't be learned.
Society needs a lot of younger people to get scammed in video games. And that may seem weird to say, but to be honest with you, I feel like there's a whole lot of people on the internet that have never faced any type of consequences for their actions in any possible way, and none of them have gotten an armor trimming in RuneScape, basically.
Every single one of these people shown have played RuneScape, and that's not a joke. Well, maybe except for one of them. What did they learn in their time in Gielinor? How did it affect their decisions in the real world? Did it cause this guy's team to finish in last place this season, while he focused on maxing his Iron Man? Heck, RuneScape might have another cultural revolution coming soon.
This game, this is like one of the craziest games ever though. Zezma?
Put old school, type in old school RuneScape. Chat, Kaisenet on RuneScape, chat? Oh my god.
It's insane to think about the real world impact that this silly kids game has had and will have, and how all of it almost never happened.
I can't afford to run this game, it's costing me money to run it. I'm going to have to shut it down, and I really didn't want to shut it down because I'd spent, well over a year making it by this point, poured everything into it.
As I set out to research this video, the real-world implication became more serious than I had even initially thought. There's a surprising number of children whose parents met in-game who would have never even been born without RuneScape. Yes, there are real people who met and got married in-game before meeting and getting married in real life as well. And then they had kids, some of whom are probably already adults. More internally, there are a bunch of people who make some, if not their whole living from RuneScape. Jagex employees, creators, artists, and even gold farmers. The most famous example being Venezuela's hyperinflated economy, causing their people to turn toward earning RuneScape's more stable virtual gold pieces, keep their lights on, and put food on the table. RuneScape's butterfly effect has reached out infinitely in both positive and negative ways. So, what exactly was this update that forever altered the course of human history?
And my mum happened to be frying some bacon one day, and I was standing there with a voice recorder recording it, and the sound of cooking in RuneScape Classic is the sound of my mum frying some bacon.
No, not that, but if you guessed that it was an update to the RuneScape world map, you'd surprisingly be right. February 27th, 2002. The Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, Utah, in the United States, had just concluded, with Germany taking home the most total medals, Norway taking home the most gold medals, and the host country finishing in just second and third in those categories, respectively. Alicia Keys won a handful of Grammys on this date, but let's be real. No one who clicked on this video cares about that. Much more relevant to our community who grew up on RuneScape music videos, Linkin Park won a Hard Rock Grammy for Crawling, and Tool won a Metal Grammy for Schism. A couple of vintage classics. Just like most of us. Far more important than these peak athletic and artistic achievements would have to be the additional time we got to spend playing video games on the family computer. While the game as it stood at the end of 2001 is essentially the free-to-play version of the game that we know today, we now also had a pay-to-play expansion to every region of the map. The update that saved RuneScape from certain extinction was none other than membership. For a fee of just $5 per month, we can now access new features, new quests, new skills, and new areas. If you had a single account with continuous membership from then until now, with the original grandfathered rate of $5 or £3.20 or €4.60 per month locked in, you would have spent approximately $1,400 or £900 or €1,300 on membership to access just one single account on just one single game, excluding FunOrb, of course. Almost every single update over the next 23 years would be locked behind this paywall, and there were really quite a lot of updates. Let's just focus on this one for now. We also saw a further expansion of the game's first region expansion of Asgarnia. Yes, just on the other side of Falador's western wall was a region further fleshed out with such iconic locations as Taverley and its dungeon, the Heroes Guild, White Wolf Mountain, and Intrana. The only thing standing in our way was the greatest enemy most of us would ever face in-game, far greater than the new highest level foe of Black Dragons. I am, of course, talking about the Taverley Gate, a timeless and iconic reminder of how difficult it was not only to pull together $5 every month as a kid, but also how difficult it was to convince an adult to get that money to Jagex. Taverley and its dungeon were complementary map expansions alongside the release of what was then called the Herblore skill, or Herblore as we know it today, or Herblore as the British would say. This was the second official new skill following the game's initial release. Jagex also threw a bone for those of us stuck on the east side of the Taverley Gate with the release of the Crafting Guild in the Hobgoblin Peninsula, which weren't a lot, but it just felt nice not to be entirely left out with such a massive update, you know? We also saw a further expansion of the game's second region expansion of Karamja. What was once a very tiny island that on its best day played home to a massive clan war, now expanded a little further west with the quiet pirate port of Brimhaven. Somehow those gangs we joined and infiltrated during the Shield of Arav quest also somehow inexplicably set up further outposts here, but nowhere else. The only reason there's a Phoenix Gang base at this isolated little port was because the Black Arm Gang also had a base here. And the only reason the Black Arm Gang set up a base at this isolated little port was because the Phoenix Gang had a base here. Even if one pulled out of town here, the other would just have 2 bases at this isolated port. It really makes you wonder why we're here. But much like magnets and the tides, you can't explain that. Now, we even saw the release of a brand new region altogether with the Kingdom of Kandarin. Although the capital city remained inaccessible at this time, we did now have access to Catherby, Camelot, and Sears Village, as well as some surrounding areas. Catherby, of course, was a quiet little fishing hamlet located in the morning shadow of White Wolf Mountain. This village served as a major buff to fishing, as you could now catch not only lobsters and swordfish like before, but now bass and sharks as well, all within close proximity of both a proper stationary range and a bank, the only new bank on the world's surface in this entire update. Much better than begging for a fire on the docks of Karamja, paying the ship's fare, and walking all the way to and from a bank in Draynor Village or Falador, like a free-to-play peasant. Of course, the release of Sharks offered a new highest healing food in the game of a whopping 20 hit points. Out in Sears Village, we also saw the addition of an interesting little building here. This was the original party room. This was a unique place where telegrab could not be cast. So if you wanted to host a proper drop party without worrying about cheaters nicking items from across the room, you could safely do so upstairs. Those of you who watched the first episode of the series may remember that the initial release of the Wilderness was the game's relatively largest ever map expansion, doubling the map in size with just a single update. Just when you thought that was gorgeous enough, it was time to flesh out the Wilderness even further. Although it didn't expand in size with this update, some of the empty spaces between notable locations were filled in. We now also had the Dark Warriors Fortress, the East Wilderness Ruins, Red Dragon Isle, now known as Lava Dragon Isle in Old School, and the Bandit Camp, as well as all of the new valuable spawns and features to lure victims away from the safety below the wilderness line. One such feature is the duty-free store in the Bandit Camp. We know this as a place where items can be sold at high alch price, but within the lore of the game's world, the price difference between this store and a normal general store is that the Bandit Camp isn't withholding any taxes on any sale. This would imply the existence of a steep 33% tax withheld when selling to a shop outside the wilderness. That would mean that the Grand Exchange tax first implemented in 2021 was not the game's first tax. Rather, it actually arrived 19 years earlier. Just to demonstrate some quick maths, you could, for example, sell steel plate legs for 600 GP without tax in the wilderness, or for 400 GP outside the wilderness. That means that to sell the same item outside the wilderness, there's an opportunity cost of 33.33%, repeating of course, in the form of a tax paid, presumably to King Rold, to help his wife pay for that fancy garden she ended up just forcing an adventurer to steal for her anyway. Jagex must have modeled old Rolly here after the tyrant King George. It sounds like we may need to begin dumping tea in the waters of Port Sarim to teach him a lesson about overtaxing his citizens.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I love the young people.
Ask yourself who the real bandits are. Thankfully, Donnie here is not just any lad, but the lad, who charges no such tax. What a fitting name for such a swell lad. Well, we finally finished covering the surface of the map now, so all that leaves is a whole other realm. Merely the game's second other realm after the Black Hole last year. Continuing with this outer space theme, we actually have to take a trip to the world's moon to visit the lost city of Xanaris. That's right. Canonically, Xanaris is located on RuneScape's moon. However, I have reason to believe this wasn't actually the case in Classic, but more on that later. Once you've made your way to the Lost City, their marketplace was the place to be if you had diamonds burning a hole in your pocket, and if you wanted to get your hands on your first dragon weapon, if you needed a ruby ring to propose to your RuneScape girlfriend, or if you just needed to unload a bunch of cabbages to a guy who always needs to buy more for whatever reason. Now, excluding the Catherby Bank, Xanaris also played home to the only other new bank that came with this massive update. That's right, somehow the Bank of Varrock managed to open a new branch on the moon, years before managing to open one in Lumbridge. No bank in Sears Village, or Port Sarim, or on the whole island of Karamja, or in the entire northern half of the map. But the moon? Oh yeah, that's no problem at all, boss. In fact, they're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year-round. My bank in the real world only seems to be open during hours while I'm too busy working to visit, and when I do manage to visit, they just keep mentioning their app. How convenient. Anyway, why do I think that Xanaris wasn't always intended to be located on the moon? If you take a look at this map here, and line up the shed in Lumbridge Swamp with the entrance of Xanaris, something peculiar happens with the marketplace exit. The marketplace in Old School has a fairy ring that teleports you to Kharid, but in Classic, it actually has a ladder instead, and it takes you straight up to Kharid, perfectly lined up with where it should be based on where the shed and the entrance are. This would suggest that it was actually just underground, rather than a completely different realm on the moon at the time. That's a wrap on just our first update to the world map of 2002. That's a lot of content for just one update, maybe the most for a single RuneScape update of all time. Access to these changes is what we paid for, and our subscription money is really what saved Jagex and saved RuneScape. But this next update would eventually give rise to someone else taking our money. March 18th, 2002. We received an iconic expansion to the game's first dungeon, the Edgeville Wilderness Dungeon. You know, that place where Framed has gone to PK millions in 29 different videos because noobs think that they're safe here and really don't seem to understand that it's actually a risky part of the wilderness. Even though after the 28th time he claimed it would be his last because players couldn't possibly be bad enough to keep falling for the same tricks, right? Right? Oh, but as both the wilderness and its dungeon should be, with great risk comes great rewards. Buried at the end of both the Edgeville Wilderness Dungeon and the Vast Taverley Dungeon came the 4 elemental obelisks. You could use your brand new glass-blowing abilities to make orbs, charge the orbs on these obelisks in the backs of these dangerous dungeons, attach the orbs to a battle staff, and use that battle staff to cast the brand new wave spells with the brand new blood runes. Alternatively, you could alch the battle staff for a good chunk of change. Wow, that's a lot of content packed into a single small update below the surface of the world map. Battle staves were especially useful in RuneScape Classic because your character would default into melee combat automatically even if you first attacked with magic or ranged. So if you cast a combat spell against an enemy without an obstacle in the way, it would drag you into melee combat and you could only cast spells as fast as you could click through the necessary menus, all without interrupting your melee attacks. Also, if a spell failed, you couldn't cast one for another 20 seconds, so you had an incentive to wield the staff for the extra magic bonus rather than just a powerful melee weapon for the melee bonuses. The battle staff in particular, though, added extra melee stats that you needed for this type of combat. It's an odd relic carried forward into RuneScape 2 and Old School where the melee stats of the staff really don't matter since you can just continually cast spells without being forced into hand-to-hand combat and without worrying about failing a spell. Instead of correcting the stats upon the release of RuneScape 2 in March of 2004, they actually didn't fix this until 19 and a half years later in Old School RuneScape by adjusting the magic attack and magic defense stats of battle staves. March 25th, 2002. The United States saw the premiere of the allegedly unscripted reality TV show The Bachelor on this date. A show where a 20 or 30-something-year-old eligible single man breaks the hearts of 24 women by giving each of them a red rose before ultimately finding the one whose heart he will wait to break until a few months later. Now, those might sound like rookie numbers to RuneScape e-daters out there, but are your fantasy relationships really all that different from their fantasy relationships? Hard for me to say. Maybe the bachelors on the show should have wasted less time caring about who gets a red rose, and instead invested more time caring about a certain blue rose. And you know the guys on that show have terrible taste when they say they want to take things slow, but then send girls like this home. Even my wife agrees with me that the sloth girl here should have won. Rest assured, the guys inevitably end up choosing someone with the personality of a damp rag whom they don't even date long enough to bother introducing to their parents. Really, what's the point? All I know is that e-dating was against the rules of RuneScape for the longest time. However, that didn't stop Paul Gower from breaking his own rules to not only attend, but also to officiate an in-game wedding on Valentine's Day in 2002, less than 2 weeks before that big membership expansion. Maybe Jagex would have gotten the next new skill out in time for that update if they were a little more focused on not breaking their own rules. Instead, we had to wait almost an entire additional month for the Fletching skill that should have dropped back in February. I assume this delay is the reason why the Lost City quest inexplicably has a crafting requirement instead of a Fletching requirement for fletching the Draymond staff needed to enter Xanaris. Remember, JMods, RuneScape is not a dating site. Now, until this point, every tree in RuneScape was just a normal tree that would give regular normal logs when chopped. With this update, the game saw the first oak, willow, maple, yew, and magic trees spread all across the world map. With these new logs you could chop, you could also now fletch them into new types of powerful bows. Other map expansions on this date included the Sorcerers Tower, the Barbarian Outpost, and the Lava Maze Dungeon. What may seem strange to many of you is that the Barbarian Outpost in Classic was not near the waterfall as we know it in Old School today. Rather, it was located near where the Legends Guild is located today. As for the Sorcerers Tower, you could also pay a hefty sum to upgrade your battle staves into mystic staves here. They were actually a melee upgrade, but not some mystical magic upgrade over the new staves from last week, despite what the name might suggest. Again, it wasn't until September of 2021 that they would fix this oversight in Old School RuneScape, even though it should have been adjusted in March of 2004 upon the release of RuneScape 2. The Lava Maze Dungeon in the Deep Wilderness also got released on this date, but didn't really introduce anything new. Just additional options for overcrowded resources and monsters like rune rocks, greater demons, and black demons. If you wanted your own private space to access these highly competitive resources, you had to be willing to risk your gear and loot to do so, but you also had the option to send any unwelcome competition back to Lumbridge. April 9th, 2002. Although the exact date is unknown, this is approximately when the first and second players both reached level 99 firemaking on the same date. Please keep in mind that this achievement is particularly insane because it was only possible to burn normal logs in Classic. So even with the release of Fletching and all of those new trees, those new logs could only be used for Fletching, not firemaking. To be fair, firemaking XP scaled with your level, so it took nearly 75,000 normal logs to reach 99, rather than the 326,000 normal logs that it would take today in Old School. You also had to manually drop each log to light it, so this took a lot more time and effort than it would take today, even without Wintertod and higher level logs, unless you had someone to drop them for you. With that in mind, you might initially believe that whoever reached level 99 firemaking first would have been like another Blue Rose 13X, who was just so insanely far ahead of everyone else in magic and smithing that it wasn't even a remotely close race to 99. But it was actually a very tight race for level 99 firemaking 23 years ago, between two players. Even stranger, it's actually not at all clear who was first and who was second. Was it Dragoon 787, or was it Cow Chicken? Believe it or not, to this very day, these two goblins still argue their respective cases as to who was actually first decades later. No, seriously, they really do. It may have allegedly even escalated to swatting and hostile Twitch stream raids filled with threats, flaming, and trolling. Although the true answer of who was actually first is lost to time, I think I've pieced together the most likely answer through context clues in some very old forum posts. I suspect that Dragoon logged in and reached level 99 and then celebrated for several hours with his friends, all in a single game session that straddled midnight in the UK. However, during the celebrations, but before midnight in the UK, Cow Chicken also reached level 99 firemaking and then immediately logged out. At the time, the high scores would only update once a day, and only upon logging out. So the high scores now showed Cow Chicken as the first and only player to have reached level 99, even though Dragoon was the first player to actually reach 99 in-game. For better or for worse, the damage was done, and the player base saw Cow Chicken reach 99 first on the high scores. And, well, they say history is written by the victors. In any event, let's get back on topic to something a bit more objective. Alongside the release of the Family Crest quest, the only map expansions were the release of the Pillars of Zanash Dungeon, which you may know better today as the Witchaven Dungeon, and a new house in southeast Varrock. That's right, those pillars southeast of Ardougne not only predate the release of the city, but also apparently have a name and some lore behind them, which you can learn if you open up the tourist guidebook found in the city. But then that begs the question, how we knew what to call this dungeon in the 3 short weeks prior to the release of Ardougne. Maybe the Family Crest Dungeon or Hellhound Dungeon, I don't know. In any case, based on this map, the quest makes you travel to the farthest, most extreme southwestern part of the entire world map, whereas today, this just seems like a random place immediately outside Ardougne. April 30th, 2002. Look guys, I don't know how to say this, but Ardougne, Ardougne, Ardougne. Yeah, that last one sounds right. We're going to go with that one. Pronouncing Ardougne without the H is like pronouncing both without the L, or pronouncing espresso without the X. Any other pronunciation should just be criminal, really. Anyway, Ardougne was released alongside the Thieving skill as a complementary map expansion to the new skill, including stalls, chests, and NPCs who could be used to train the new skill. From a lore perspective, Ardougne also serves as the capital city of the Kingdom of Kandarin, and for now, it's just the east side of Ardougne in-game. According to the surprisingly interesting guidebook that we mentioned earlier, Ardougne is known as an exciting, modern city located on the sun-drenched southern coast of Kandarin. Yes, the book still says Artie is on the southern coast of Kandarin today, even though that is demonstrably not the case. Once again, another relic from RuneScape Classic that should have been fixed back in 2003 or 2004, but has still persisted into both RuneScape 3 and old school RuneScape today. Now, the book also calls Ardougne the City of Shopping. We all know about the 5-finger discounts offered at the stalls in the main marketplace, but a nice feature at release was actually the unique offerings of its general store. Instead of the usual fare offered by other general stores around the map, this shop specifically sells common vital quest supplies like rope, papyrus, and other various tools regularly required by quests that weren't found in many other convenient places prior to this. The guidebook then goes on to describe Ardougne as the City of Fun. Of course, it lists the pub like every proper city has. However, the city also uniquely contains the only zoo in the game, besides the spooned menagerie at its Will's house, of course. What's strange is that the book goes on to list a third destination for fun that most players have probably never visited, the Ardougne sewers. According to the book, for the adventurous, there are always rats to be slaughtered in Ardougne's expansive and vermin-ridden sewers. There is truly something for everybody here. Let's move on. Speaking of menacing pests,
he's a menace to the entire city!
May 8th, 2002. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man premiered this week and sat atop the box office. To indulge anyone who felt inspired to become a menace themselves, Jagex expanded the map once again as we return to the far north to see the introduction to the members-only Deep Wilderness. From Ardougne, you could pull a cursed lever to teleport all the way to the infamous Deserted Keep, where you might encounter such fearsome foes as Pol Levser. If you were lucky enough to survive an encounter with him or other similar cryptids, you too could travel east to AFK Train at the Axe Hut. Past that, the historically useless Scorpion Pit that plays home to Scorpia in Old School today, and in the farthest northeast corner of the entire map lies the Rogue's House, or Rogue's Castle as we know it today. To the west of the Deserted Keep lies the Pirates' Hideout, and strangely, exactly half of a Redberry pie inside. Rumor has it that these pirates once had acquired a full Redberry pie from some poor adventurer passing through their encampment within the Asgarnia Ice Dungeon, who was just trying to help some squire or other, but some kind of nearby apex predator caught a whiff of it and actually managed to eat half of the pie before the pirates noticed. Fortunately, Jagex didn't allow even Thurgo to eat both halves of a pie in the same tick before he had to retreat. To keep the remaining half safe, the pirates decided that some of their crew would remain, but the rest would circumnavigate the continent to get as far away from the hunter as they could and set up camp in this hideout in the wilderness, where they locked the doors behind them. The beast would have to navigate all the way north and survive through the wilderness just to find out it needs a lockpick, walk all the way back, smith its own lockpick, and make its way back again. It was a perfect plan, as it would give them plenty of time to escape. Although their ship was severely damaged upon landing, they knew it would be safer to take their chances hiding amongst the fire giants and shadow spiders in the Deep Wilderness Dungeon to their immediate south than to stand between Thurgo and half a Redberry pie. As a last resort, they could always make their way to the west, to the new northern expansion of the Frozen Waste Plateau. That's the story of how the exact same pirates from the Asgarnia Ice Dungeon ended up in level 50 Wilderness with a crashed ship and half a Redberry pie. There was also one other addition to the wilderness just south of here, the Deep Wilderness Chaos Temple. You know, that one place where Iron Men on Old School go to get PK'd by YouTubers who just reset their banks to zero, maybe allowing for a single trendy item. You know, you'd think that concept would get old after a while, but alas. What also gets old is when the players who brought their entire stack of noted bones into the wilderness go to Reddit to whine about getting PK'd in the wilderness, as if it would be balanced game design to have an effective 7 times XP multiplier per bone be risk-free. If you want a risk-free XP multiplier, you better get a head start on gathering those buckets of slime, because the Ectofuntus is your only risk-free option. And before you start running to the comments to enlighten me that player-owned houses and gilded altars exist, let's just say that we all know of someone who would beg to differ about that option being risk-free. Outside the wilderness, we did get a couple of small changes to the world map with Chuck's Workshop and the Makeover Mage Hut. Chuck's Place was where you could go to exchange logs and stackable certificates, much like Miles, Niles, and Giles for fish, whores, and bars in Draynor Village Market. Notably, the North Ardougne bank that you would expect to be next door would not exist for several more months. The Makeover Mage Hut is the place where players could go to change their appearance. Not only did this mean that the palest guy in your future Discord could pretend to have the darkest skin tan available, but now players who overzealously click through character creation, like my brother, wouldn't have to all look identical to one another with the default appearance. And speaking of clones and bots, May 28th, 2002, Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, also premiered just a couple of weeks beforehand. If you, like Anakin Skywalker, are also not fond of sand, women, and children, then don't worry, because this update doesn't add any more of them to break the immersion of your favorite retro medieval clicking simulator, or whatever it is you guys are saying these days. With only one tiny exception on the other side of White Wolf Mountain, all of our updates on this date take place within the new Kingdom of Kandarin. Certers Village finally got its own bank. No longer would you have to go from the flax field to the spinning wheel to Catherby Bank to make and bank those bowstrings. No longer would you have to chop an inventory of maple logs and walk all the way to Catherby to bank, since now there was a bank right next to the maple trees in Certers Village. Just to the west, we also got another little fishing hamlet called Hemenster, as well as the mostly useless McGruber's Wood. It's a pretty underwhelming area for taking up such a large amount of space, and really is a mostly useless area after the fishing contest, with a couple of niche exceptions in the future. The main reward of the quest, of course, was to bypass White Wolf Mountain with a safe underground shortcut to reach Kandarin from Asgarnia, or vice versa. This may not seem like a big deal today, since you can just take the long way around to avoid the wolves in Old School, but in Classic, there was no safe long way around, so you had to face the wolves head-on to make it across the mountain. And don't forget that in Classic, you would have to face an enemy for at least 3 rounds of combat before you could possibly escape or eat. So this was a pretty dangerous trek for the average low-leveled player. Most players also didn't have the magic level required to teleport to Camelot anyway. So this tunnel was a lifesaver for the average player. Literally. Further south in Kandarin, we also saw an expansion to the south of Artie with the release of the monastery and surrounding area alongside the Monk's Friend quest. The monastery was originally shaped in an interesting way. It reminds me of the coldest days of winter for some reason. Anyway, what a year for the southern side of the world. Speaking of which, June 17th, 2002. Brazil was on the verge of winning its second in just 3 World Cups, this time over Germany in Japan. This absolute legend scored both of the goals in the final to lead Brazil to glory. Germany would go on to get some payback against Brazil in Brazil 12 years later on Germany's way to winning its first ever World Cup, not to be confused with West Germany's big win in 1990. This revenge was many years in the making. Speaking of plotting revenge for many years, we also saw the release of the Temple of Ikov quest on this date, where we either helped Lucian steal the Staff of Armadil or not, on his own quest for revenge. This, of course, introduced the mostly useless Temple of Ikov dungeon that really doesn't serve any useful function after the quest until the release of RuneScape 2, since the Boots of Lightness found inside the dungeon would go on to lower your weight by 4 kilograms. Not applicable in Classic, though. This update also served as an expansion and a sequel of sorts to the last update. The area south of Artie also added the Clock Tower alongside the similarly named quest. Now, if you just move the clock tower in front of the monastery, then it would feel a little bit more like summer. Hemenster also saw a major expansion with the release of the Fishing Guild. It has a pretty rough entry requirement compared to other guilds, but it was a nice area that allowed players to catch any type of fish close to a bank, even closer than in Catherby. Even McGruber's Wood got an expansion of sorts. The locked building now had a key that allowed players to bypass the Temple of Ikov dungeon all the way to the very back. The only useful feature in the back was some additional lesser demon spawns that helped to reduce overcrowding at other spawns in Classic. Other than this, McGruber's Wood really only served the purpose of being an unnecessary obstacle that arbitrarily gave great utility to the next update just by being in the way. July 23rd, 2002. We all had that highly functional friend of a friend in our 20s with the goofy nickname and the natural talent for amateur mixology, who put his talents to good use at your favorite house parties. For Paul and Andrew Gower, the original founders of Jagex and RuneScape, that real-life mate was known as none other than Stankers. The absolute legend himself and his infamous poison chalices were forever immortalized into RuneScape. Much like his poison chalices from the real world, the ones in-game were also hit or miss and could have any variety of effects. Notably, the only way to boost your creativity enough for a +1 boost to your crafting level at the time. These extracurricular hobbies make you wonder what these guys like the real Stankers went on to do for a living. If they didn't open a pub named after their nickname, the chances are good that they became a successful businessman, got elected to some high-ranking political office, or took on some other kind of significant leadership role. In-game, however, he was none other than the supervisor for one of the most important quality-of-life content updates in all of Classic. Look, I really can't overstate the importance of mining coal in Classic. We didn't have these bosses like Zulrah in Old School that just shit out resources like 200 noted coal every 15 drops. We either had to get them the old-fashioned way, or we had to buy them from someone else who got them the old-fashioned way. Coal rocks were generally far from banks, they were a highly contested resource, and there was no such thing as a coal bag back then. So what seems like a useless feature today was actually revolutionary in 2002. I am of course talking about the coal trucks, minecarts located next to the largest concentration of coal rocks in the game that could store several inventories worth of coal at a time. And then those minecarts carried your coal for you to another location near the Sears Village bank that allowed you to empty the minecarts much easier. This really saved a lot of time. Instead of having to bank after every inventory, which would have been a very long walk all the way around the fishing guild since neither the agility skill nor the Eastern Log shortcut existed yet. You could stay and wait to bank after mining, storing 4 inventories worth in the carts, plus a 5th inventory in your own bag. All this coal was crucial to players being able to train their smithing skill, and crucial for smithing the type of low-level, free-to-play gear that may not impress us by today's standards, but still played a very important role in the game's ecosystem in 2002. And as we've seen with many of the other popular mines as well, Jagex also added aggressive enemies amongst the rocks to deter level 3 mining bots. We also saw the release of 3 new quests that all added more real estate to the game: Holy Grail, Fight Arena, and Draynor Village. Holy Grail of course added the Fisher King realm, but it also added the jungle west of Brimhaven, including the Horseshoe of Gold Rocks, which were also a competitive resource at the time. To prevent level 3 bots from mining the gold here, once again, Jagex made sure to include these poisonous scorpions here to help limit their access to only legitimate players. The use of specifically poisonous scorpions in particular is notable because they were spawned in such a way that they were pretty much impossible to avoid, and if a bot got poisoned, it would eventually die even a while after leaving combat, but notably before being able to bank. Also, one interesting note about the Fisher King realm is that the Black Knight Titan from the quest remains the last graphical relic of RuneScape 2 within RuneScape 3. They forgot to update him during the many graphical reworks and then just decided to keep him that way as a running joke, although there is a way to opt into an updated graphical model for the character if you really want to. This is the one and only game model that is identical between Old School and RuneScape 3 today. The other 2 quests, Fight Arena and Draynor Village, also further expanded this area south of Ardougne, like the previous 2 world map expansions in May and June. This time we got the Battlefield of Khazard, the Draynor Village, and the Fight Arena, and Port Khazard. All of these new areas revolve around General Khazard, who would go on to play a big role in some endgame quests in the distant future. It really gets you wondering if they had these storylines planned out so many years in advance, or if they retconned some future storylines around some old throwaway characters. I suspect the answer is actually a little bit of both based on the RS3 timeline, but what do I know? Someone should ask Modad. The main significance of these updates to the world map would have to be the game's first transportation system, besides teleport spells and ships. That's right, this date also saw the release of Spirit Trees. Players who managed to beat the Khazard Warlord were rewarded with access to this transportation network that could take you to or from the Draynor Village. The only 2 other Spirit Tree locations upon release were at the Battlefield of Khazard, essentially just allowing players to bypass the maze, in this seemingly random location here, northwest of Varrock and east of Edgeville, just south of the wilderness. This location was pretty inconvenient since before the Grand Exchange there were no shortcuts in or out of the city, but at least we now had easy transportation from the far east side of the map to the far west side of the map. With just these 3 locations to choose from, the Fairy's Flight Relic might have been one of the most useless of all time if we had leagues at the time in Classic. August 15th, 2002. We saw the release of the Haziel Cult quest, which opened up the sewers south of Ardougne, as well as the Kharidian Mansion and the incinerator from the beloved Sheepherder quest. Haziel Cult was another one of those quests that wouldn't really have an impact on any future quest for a long time. However, the proximity to the release of the Khazard quest makes me think that they really did have an elaborate plan all along, even if the specifics didn't get ironed out until the distant future. In any case, the Majrat storyline, even over 22 years, turned out to be more cohesive and planned out than the entire Star Wars sequel trilogy. Yes, these 20-something-year-old socially awkward computer nerds from the UK managed to write a better, more interesting story than alleged professional Hollywood writers. I want to say that's impressive, but by comparison, it probably wasn't that difficult to do a better job in this case. What's interesting here is that if we look at an underground map of the sewers lined up with the surface of the map, we can see that the sewers perfectly bifurcate East Ardougne from the then future update of West Ardougne. This would imply that the two sides of the city share a sewer system, which is pretty suspicious seeing as their tour guidebook advertises the sewers as a fun place to visit, especially because there would inevitably be plague-ridden sewage and rats down there. I don't know, seems really suspicious, but those sheep that appeared north of the city sure are all sorts of unnatural bright colors, almost as if their wool had been dyed. If only we had some sort of plumber with a pressure washer of sorts to verify all of these new problems. August 27th, 2002. North America had just seen the release of Super Mario Sunshine, a shiny, bright, and colorful new installment of this iconic series, which was a general trend we would see in many other games for the Nintendo GameCube. However, the game wouldn't release in Europe until the following May, so Jagex must have missed the memo on that gaming trend since just one day later, Jagex would release a dark, gloomy, rat-infested, plague-filled, hopeless quarantine zone. That's right, we saw not only the release of the Plague City quest and West Ardougne, but this update also started one of the wildest, genre-bending quest lines of all time. At first, it seems like at face value that it really is a plague-infested city where you have to rescue Elena. After all, there are even plague-infected sheep nearby who need to be incinerated, so we know it's real. Right? Elena soon discovers that the so-called plague is a hoax being used to cover up the discovery of elves in the far west. To get there, you need to traverse a deadly underground dungeon below the Galarpos Mountains, where a fragment of a dead elf god pretends to be the son of the usurper Zamorak and drives the players to madness, even making them spill the blood of an innocent unicorn. Geez, this lady sounds like a total psycho. No wonder they had to lock her up multiple times for her own safety. After all that, you accidentally help evil elves by killing the king's brother at the king's command. More like fratricide than regicide at that point, but okay. Then you dye some sheep, various colors, to further perpetuate the plague hoax. Then you help the good elves seal the Death Altar as the ultimate source of power, as if the Blood Rune Altar and Wrath Rune Altars don't exist as well. Then you discover the king is evil, and that he faked the plague specifically for his own power. Elena was going around telling the truth about the plague, so King Lathus and the mourners imprisoned her. So naturally, you had to cosplay as one of the king's professional pickpocket victims to stage several false flags to garner enough support against the king, lead an uprising against him, have him executed, unite various ancient clans of elves, defeat the fragment of a god, and regrow the crystal city of Prifddinas, where they lived happily ever after. Wait, this all started with helping a dad find his missing daughter who was just trying to provide some humanitarian aid to the sick? Just wild stuff. This quest line kinda reminds me of Sam Raimi's original Evil Dead trilogy, starting as the classic, archetypal, cabin-in-the-woods horror movie, and eventually somehow morphing into some fantasy epic 2 movies later during Army of Darkness. How do they even come up with this stuff? Once the dust had settled with the fragment of Sarin shattered and the crystal city of Prifddinas restored, rumor has it that Elena wanted to keep chasing that high of her plague hoax being proven right all along, when everyone else doubted her, except for us, who knew better. She followed up on whispers and rumors of other suspicious conspiracies to the ends of the world, trying to recreate the magic, sometimes even making accusations about other world leaders as well, but was never quite able to find that next smoking gun like she did with the inert plague sample we gathered for her during the biohazard quest. Funding all of this travel was expensive, so she resorted to hawking dangerous dietary supplements that deplete one's vitality and resilience to her gullible followers, who believed all of her insane ramblings just to cover her costs, no matter the consequences. How sad. Anyway, finally back to the world map. The northern side of East Ardougne also got a little love on this day too, when they finally added the North Bank to East Ardougne as well. That's right, it took nearly 4 months after the release of Chuck, a Certer NPC for logs who lived in this building, to get a nearby bank. Without Chuck being here, we may never have gotten a bank here. To thank him for his permanent, lasting contributions, Jagex removed him from RuneScape 2, but left his vacant house standing. I personally think they should bring him back, even if he's just retired and it serves no other utility besides some inevitable new clue step in 2027 or something. September 9th, 2002. This date saw the release of the Sea Slug quest and also the small map expansion of the fishing platform. Another one of those relics of the past that really serves no function in the future and could have just as easily been a quest-only instanced area rather than an actual location on the surface of the world map. The fishing platform canonically is probably one of the worst places to fish in the game because the platform has been overrun by mind-controlling sea slugs, which we can only assume are a tribute to or rip-off of either the headcrab zombies from the Half-Life series, the Flood from the Halo series, or maybe even both. Or, let's be honest, it's most likely reference to some obscure sci-fi story from the 1980s that no one has ever heard of except for inevitably that one guy in the comments who, no doubt, will be sure to let us all know. Anyway, the fishing platform wouldn't be the last map update of September. By the end of the month, we would see Jagex go on to release both the beginning and the end of RuneScape Classic, all on the very same day. RuneScape has one of the most famous tutorials in all of gaming, but it wasn't always like that. The game didn't even have a real tutorial for the first 2 years. In the first version of the tutorial, wasn't exactly the same iconic tutorial island that you may remember. So if you had logged into RuneScape in those early days, you had to be ready to get thrown to the wolves. And by wolves, of course, I mean the Highwayman, the Dark Wizard south of Varrock, player killers, and, well, yes, the literal wolves on White Wolf Mountain as well. But the biggest and baddest wolf of them all during all of RuneScape Classic was none other than the King Black Dragon. And would you believe it if I told you that the KBD was released on the very same day as Tutorial Island? So before Tutorial Island became the player's virtual school and Brenna taught us how to chop trees, light fires, and catch shrimp, you instead had to learn how to play RuneScape alone at the School of Hard Knocks. Or if you were lucky, you may have experienced a homemade tutorial from your schoolmates, from your brother's friend, or from that weird kid in the school library who also played the game. Their tutorial of the game was quite a bit different from the real one and featured such impossible tasks as how to use shears and dye on a chef's hat to make your own party hat, how to buy a girlfriend for the low price of 10k GP, how to duplicate your best item by dropping it and then pressing Alt and F4, how to claim random buildings as your own to roleplay the cancelled player-owned housing developments. And who could forget, how to detect an attempt to lure you into the wilderness so you don't get PK'd and lose all of your items. Wait, that last one is actually from the real tutorial? Even if you're a seasoned veteran of the game who remembers the original tutorial island, I guarantee you'll be shocked by some of the other oddities from the early days of RuneScape. I've spent thousands of hours putting together the timeline that tells a totally different story about the history of the game from a perspective that you've never heard before. So strap in and let me tell you all about it. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss any of the surprises in store today. September 24th, 2002. North American audiences were captivated by American Idol, Spirited Away, Kingdom Hearts, Animal Crossing, and most importantly,
Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome.
Friends won a couple of Emmy Awards on this date, but if you didn't have an apartment full of friends to teach you how to play RuneScape before work or after school, that's okay, because Brenna and Vanica were the only friends you really needed. It's just too bad that Vanica gives us a bronze sword instead of one of those keyblades from Kingdom Hearts. You know, the sword that's actually a key, but when you stick it in someone, it unlocks their death. So the original tutorial island here was mostly the same one that we know and love from RuneScape 2. However, what's interesting is that in Classic, Tutorial Island actually had a special section that we didn't have in RuneScape 2 or any version of the game today. There really was a whole section dedicated to learning about both the brutal risks and great rewards of the wilderness. They probably shouldn't have removed this section of the tutorial as a requirement for graduation because there are still players today who don't seem to understand this concept. I'm sure they removed it because it scared too many new players away, but without it, some players now feel entitled to the rewards that the wilderness has to offer, but at the same time think they should also be exempt from the associated risks. Despite what you may hear on Reddit, you just simply cannot separate the risks from the rewards. As a result, many players who made their first visit to Tutorial Island after 2003 genuinely just don't seem to understand that the wilderness really is a dangerous place and just blindly wander in. They literally had to add a ditch to the wilderness in 2007 to stop players from unintentionally bringing valuables into the wilderness. If you want to find players intentionally bringing valuables into the wilderness, look no further than the players who now hunt the endgame boss of RuneScape Classic that was also released on this same date, the King Black Dragon. The KBD would remain the toughest boss in game, for at least a couple of years, well into RuneScape 2. The most efficient way to kill him was to bring some friends to tap in and out as needed. While waiting for their turn to melee, they could also range him, even though multi-combat didn't technically exist yet. Regardless, taking turns also allowed players ample time to heal from damage taken in an effort to evenly spread the boss's damage around. This was no easy fight, even with a team, but the rewards of the elusive Dragon Medhelm and a pretty good chance at the rare piece of the Dragon Square Shield made it all worth it for those best-in-slot upgrades that we covered in another video. It's just ironic that the endgame boss of Classic was released on the very same day as the tutorial. Perhaps releasing these two updates together is what inspired Jagex from 2008 to 2011 to remove Tutorial Island and replace it with some flawed and ineffective tutorials called Learning the Ropes and Unstable Foundations that both involved slaying a dragon. You know, that thing you're not supposed to do until you've completed the free-to-play version of the game. In total, Jagex tried 5 failed alternative tutorials over the course of a decade in RuneScape 3, but ultimately settled on a return to a revamped Tutorial Island. One more life lesson after leaving Tutorial Island here in 2002 was to not trust your mates to actually split the D-Medhelm drop, supposedly promising to pay you back in monthly installments while they paraded around the whole map wearing your glorious prize, claiming to be earning the necessary GP for your split. Fortunately, we knew just who to call to get our money now after being unable to avoid this jingle while just trying to watch TV over summer break that year. Now, this day saw one last change to the map as well, with the addition of Backstorian Falls, the waterfall north of Ardougne that was, as the name would imply, released alongside the Waterfall quest. You know, that one quest that everyone does at the start of a new member's account today to immediately jump 30 levels in attack and strength right away. Well, that trick didn't exactly work back then. In fact, what if I told you that no quest XP rewards were ever originally meant to allow players to just skip the early game all the way from level 1 to level 30? The reality is that quest XP rewards in Classic actually scaled with your level. Completing Waterfall quest at level 1 attack would immediately boost you a whopping 4 levels up to level 5. Good enough to equip steel weapons, but not good enough for adamant like today. At best, you could jump up to 8 levels from level 12 to level 20 to equip mithril weapons. At level 60, we reach an equilibrium of sorts between the two game engines. The formula for the XP reward at level 60 in Classic equals the flat XP reward in RuneScape 2 and Old School RuneScape. Does this imply that during the transition from Classic to RuneScape 2, that Jagex believed that this quest should be completed by those who already have level 60 attack and strength? Because I don't think it was their intention for brand new level 3 accounts to complete this quest and skip 30 levels of progression. Check out some of these other iconic quests and see what level Jagex assumed you already had prior to completion based on each quest's XP reward formula. I actually think that despite Rendy's best efforts to prove them wrong today, most of these were actually pretty reasonable assumptions for the average contemporary player based on the game engine in RuneScape Classic in 2002, but they really just didn't translate to RuneScape 2's game engine. The quests were just a lot easier in the RuneScape 2 engine. It's yet another example of one of those odd relics carried forward from Classic that should have been corrected in March of 2004 with the release of RuneScape 2, but ultimately wasn't. Lastly on this date, we saw the release of the first of the God Letters, the early precursor to Posty Pete's Post Bag from the Hedge, where Andrew Gower would offer in-universe responses to fan mail from the perspective of the gods. In these letters, we learned all of the following, among much more. Peers are an abomination. The Kharid kebab shop uses goblin meat rather than camel meat. Damrak is a Chad and ladies' man who goes commando. Even the gods know of Thurgo's ravenous and insatiable appetite for Redberry pie. And the lake south of Taverley is filled with raw sewage from Falador. Someone should probably tell that to that one druid doing laundry there. October 23rd, 2002. Just 3 days after the revival of Top Gear, featuring Jeremy Clarkson, Richard Hammond, James May, and The Stig. The renewal of a beloved British television program that was now even bigger. But don't you dare try to watch in the UK without a telly license, or the BBC Bobbies will start knocking on your door with vigor. This is also the date in RuneScape when we were first called Bwana, which, as we all know, directly translates to new friend. The first thing you probably notice with this map update is all of these new icons that appear everywhere. Those represent beds that players could now sleep in, or rather, had to sleep in. Some of them were already in the game, such as upstairs in the house I claimed as my own, north of Falador Park, the same house that eventually moved south of the park with the spade spawn, and an estate agent squatter. In hindsight, I should have never trusted him with the key to sell the place after I moved to Remington 19 years ago. I figured he was trustworthy because he sponsored the Falador Park Homeowners Association resident directory, and his contact info was all there on the back page. I should have been more suspicious when he claimed his name was just estate agent, but alas. Even more strange than that guy, these beds also popped up in some really odd and remote places. According to one of those upcoming god letters we just mentioned, there originally were no beds in the wilderness, which made training there practically impossible. But they did eventually add some there. The sapphire spawn on the Spider Hill just south of the deep wilderness fence was once found in a house with a bed. Moss Giant Island northwest of Brimhaven wouldn't release until the next map update, but also randomly contained some cake in a bed. Even the building that would eventually merge with the Deep Wilderness Dungeon stairs randomly had a bed. Why were those beds actually shoehorned in seemingly randomly all across the map? You see, there used to be a fatigue system, or fatigue as I used to pronounce it until my parents overheard me and correctly taught me how to pronounce this fancy new word. In Classic, having a full inventory wouldn't stop you from continuing to mine or woodcut or fish. However, after this update, almost every XP generating action in-game was now assigned a certain fatigue value, and once you hit 100% fatigue, you would stop gaining experience altogether. The only way to reset it was to go to sleep in either a bed or eventually a portable sleeping bag upon their release 7 months later in May 2003, even though Jagex never even wanted to release them in the first place. Imagine if we had this fatigue system in old school RuneScape today, and you went to redeem the cooking XP from a bunch of wines or combat XP from pest control, and you just got nothing because you forgot you were already at 100% fatigue. If it were one of those 200 mil cooking XP at once accounts live streaming their 1 million unfermented jugs of wine, then the rage from that moment would be historic. But the community roasting of that player would be even more historic, probably being memed for decades to come. We would probably even be reminiscing about it in the retirement home in the 2070s. Now, while asleep, you would have had to enter a prehistoric CAPTCHA. Sometimes the CAPTCHAs were cute. Sometimes they were cheeky, nerdy, dirty, or accusatory. Sometimes the Brits at Jagex would confess their own ancestral guilt. Sometimes Jagex would show us their greatest desires, or tell us about future updates. And sometimes they would clairvoyantly tell us what we would receive in lieu of a bonus at work 23 years in the future. Although these would be easily solvable by a modern bot, any of those would seem almost refreshing for a real human today, instead of trying to teach some self-driving car's crappy AI the difference between a traffic light and a bus. As previously mentioned, prior to this update, you could just keep skilling forever, like one of those early skilling relics during leagues. Even with a full inventory, you could keep mining or fishing or woodcutting to your heart's content, with all of the extra resources automatically falling onto the floor without having to manually drop them. Power training with iron ore, teak logs, or barbarian fishing in old school RuneScape today wouldn't be so bad if we still had this. In fact, this was a pretty significant training method in Classic. That Dragoon guy, who was debatably the first to 99 firemaking, did so by following around the top woodcutter at the time and lighting all of the automatically dropped logs from them. The trade-off compared to today is that you had to manually click for every attempt at gathering a resource back then, whereas in RuneScape 2 or old school, your character would keep trying automatically until successful, but you had to manually empty your inventory when it got full. However, this was obviously no concern for the bot plague, hence the introduction of the fatigue system to slow them down. Speaking of plagues, we also saw another installment of the plague quest line with the biohazard quest. By far and away, the most mentioned quest in the god letters for some reason. Andrew Gower must have been particularly proud of this quest because he kept finding ways to shoehorn it into responses to unrelated letters. Speaking of pride, Biohazard is also the quest where Elena confesses her feelings for your character on the very same day that beds were introduced to the game. Coincidence? It is interesting how progressive the real dialogue here was in 2002. Elena would profess her love for your character, whether you were the Old Knight or Blue Rose 13X, canonically making Elena the first established LGBT character in RuneScape over 20 years ago. What's even more interesting is that the player base back then wasn't soft like it is today, so no one was really bothered by this. There were no riots about this, no whiny forum posts, no meme spammers on Reddit celebrating it, and definitely no tantrums from the mouth-breathing ogres on Twitter claiming, "This is political," or "Stop breaking my immersion," or "Stick to RuneScape," or any one of their other iconic fake excuses they used to harass Mod Ash and his colleagues on there. How fitting, though, that these very same ogres also saw the release of their ancestral homeland of Feldip Hills on this date too. But we also had a lot of other real estate added on this day as well. The most notable other entries to our list had to be Luwanai and Yanil. You know, that place where Josh isn't gaming is, in fact, gaming. I don't care what he says or how pleasant his homemade music is, that man is a fraud. He claims he isn't gaming, but clearly he is. Why won't he just admit it? Anyway, as you can see, Jagex was clearly continuing their southward and westward pushes into both Kandarin and Karamja. Furthermore, it would also make more sense if the impassable mountain terrain of the Galarpos Mountains was released with this update rather than the next one. But it's difficult to say for sure since the 3 official wikis show 3 different release dates. Regardless, while the game saw a lot of new real estate in October, it would be nearly 2 months before we would see another major update to the game. Fortunately, we saw a gauntlet of releases of iconic movies and other games to occupy our time and attention in the meantime, one of which featured Eminem, who is now a grandfather. Feel old yet? A small selection of familiar titles might be Vice City, Metroid Prime, Cubivore, Ratchet & Clank, 8 Mile, Chamber of Secrets, 28 Days Later, and Die Another Day. You know, the title of that Bond film would suggest that there would be a better day to die than that one, but just when exactly was this best day to die? December 12th, 2002, the release of the Agility skill. The game saw yet another massive map expansion alongside the release of the new skill. Just like Karamja being the fishing expansion, Haverly being the herblore expansion, Sears Village being the Fletching expansion, and Ardougne being the Thieving expansion, the Gnome Stronghold now served as not only the Agility map expansion, but also far more importantly, as the home of the iconic Gnome Child, famously recognized by scapers and non-scapers alike for his adoration of only the dankest of memes. Within the Gnome Stronghold was, of course, the Gnome Agility course, and soon also the Gnome Ball Field in January as RuneScape's second ever minigame. We also received the Barbarian Agility course and Yanil Agility Dungeon as well. The Agility Dungeon was also a hotspot for Herblord training as well, with the release of a new mini-boss many of you have probably never even heard of called Solarin the Twisted. He can only be defeated using strike spells with mind runes, even if some nerd showed up in max mage with Tumikin Shadow, or max range with a twisted bow, or max melee with a rune 3-handed sword, they would still just splash or miss every time. Meanwhile, a fresh Iron Man account, fire striking everything in sight, can just walk up and get the KO, assuming they have the agility or thieving level to make it this far. Once finally slain, he sometimes drops Sinister Keys, which are aptly used to unlock the Sinister Chest, which contains a fixed and consistent assortment of herbs, the only way at the time of obtaining the brand new Torstal herb. These new herbs could be used to make brand new Zami brews, but they also required Jangerberries, which were also newly released on this day, and these could only be found west of Yanil amongst the ogres. The map also shrank from a certain point of view with the new agility shortcuts to make it a bit quicker to get around the ever-expanding world map, as well as some new areas that could only be accessed by those as nimble as cat on a hot tin roof. One such area was the brand new Moss Giant Island via the rope swing to get there, requiring a whopping level 10 agility. Your character even does a little bit of a Tarzan scream while swinging across the rope. This update also began the Monkey quest line with the release of the Grand Tree quest and infamous villain Gloff, the evil gnome who thought The Amazing Race was a television show about his fellow gnomes, but plotted to destroy humans when he found out the show was really about PC gamers. With that quest, we also saw a second small expansion to Karamja with the Shipyard, another one of those mostly useless places that probably could have just been an instance, barely worth even mentioning here. Let's go back to the Grand Tree for just a moment. A lot of players have false memories of the Gnome Restaurant minigame being released in 2006. However, it was actually the first ever minigame in all of RuneScape much earlier than that. The 2006 update was just a rework, so the wiki actually gets this release date wrong, as evidenced by the introduction of gnome foods like Toad Crunchies and Chocolate Bombles. In the original version of the Gnome Restaurant, all orders would be delivered to a Luft Gian, rather than to gnomes within the Gnome Stronghold or all around the world. It's just that no one really participated in this minigame because there weren't really any rewards, and the cooking XP involved was negligible at best. We've all worked jobs like that in real life we'd rather forget, where we got almost no pay, and no valuable experience, so I can understand why players subconsciously wanted to suppress this memory as well. Speaking of terrible jobs, the gnomes of the Gnome Stronghold weren't the only source of high fantasy released this month, as just 2 weeks later, only a few days before the end of the year, the world would also see the founding of LinkedIn. This one is by far and away the worst and fakest of all the social media apps where so-called professionals with delusions of adequacy network with their current and former work peers and greatly exaggerate their skills and experience. Somehow, it would be far sadder and even more pathetic if these works of fiction actually happened. And you know, if such a website somehow existed within RuneScape, that these gnome restaurant workers would all be claiming to be a master chef, mixologist, and executive delivery boy offering customized white glove client experiences while delicately handling transactions for a multi-million GP corporation. Nah bro, you just worked the Sunday of the Gnome Ball Championship one time while putting yourself through Tutorial Island, and now you think you deserve a free pass to an internship at the Dwarven Consortium in Keldagrim, exchanging commodities? Bro needs a serious reality check. January 27th, 2003. Somebody had to put these delusional employees in their place, and who better than Terry Tate, office linebacker.
You know you need a cover sheet on your TPS reports, Richard!
It was announced during the previous day's Super Bowl that Terry and others like him would be joining American workplaces everywhere to increase productivity by taking down common office nuisances like HR.
Never be penetrated without HR approval.
This was exactly the type of farm system or development squad needed for the country to win its 37th Super Bowl in a row. In fact, that record is still active over 20 years later. Is the rest of the world even trying? Well, no, not exactly, I guess, but at least the country that invented the sport is actually winning it, unlike the Stanley Cup for the last 30 years, or the World Cup for the last 60 years. Like, imagine if the Gnome Stronghold and Gnome Village started losing the Gnome Ball Championship to Shilo Village or Brimhaven every year. It would just be pathetic. Speaking of Karamja, the world saw an expansion further south into the island with the release of Shilo Village and the similarly named quest, but the villagers were perhaps a little too focused on fending off an army of the undead to surpass the gnomes at Gnome Ball. But much like in Gnome Ball, they wanted to win and survive this zombie apocalypse. They were going to need a plan of action from a seasoned professional. So here's the plan for Shilo Village quest. Okay, we take Hajidi's cart, arrive in Shilo Village, go in, kill the one small favor guy, sorry Yanni, grab the steel key ring with the bone key, go to Queen Rashilia's tomb, tell her to piss off, retreat to MacGruber's wood to trap her army of the dead in a place no human will ever venture, head to Brother Galahad's, pull up, have a cup of tea, and wait for this whole thing to blow over. No. That wouldn't be safe. There's a top secret section of broken fence they could potentially escape from and infect all of Kandarin. Okay, take the cart, arrive in Shilo Village, kill the one small favor guy, sorry, grab the keys, go to Queen Rashilia's tomb, tell her to piss off, lure her army of the dead to Shilo Village, go to the dead man's chest in Brimhaven, have a nice cold pint, and wait for all of this to blow over. No, I guess we can't sacrifice all of Shilo Village like that. Okay, we gather some items and information from around the island, we head over to Queen Rashilia's tomb, take care of Nazastrul, we go over to her son's tomb, bury them together to bring her spirit to peace, return to Shilo Village, and kill the one small favor guy anyway, just in case he was the last remaining zombie. How's that for a slice of fried gold? Now, speaking of certified gold and platinum, January 28th, 2003. Amy Lee of Evanescence had just personally asked each and every single one of us to wake her up inside. You know, Mike Shinoda from Linkin Park actually declined the opportunity to perform the rap feat in the middle of the song. Maybe if he had done it, we wouldn't have been too embarrassed to admit that, let's just be honest, we're all among friends here. We all secretly enjoyed that song. Unfortunately, Jagex didn't get the memo because they were clearly asleep at the wheel on this date, and they didn't ask any of us for a wake-up call. This map update finally saw the release of Gnome Ball, but more importantly, saw the release of the Wilderness Agility Arena for much better XP rates for high-level players. This continues our theme of high risk, high reward, and the Wait, you mean you could just get broken XP rates here without any risk? How does that make any sense? The whole philosophy of the wilderness had been fairly consistent up until this point. High risk, high reward. Now players had no incentive to risk anything here for top agility XP rates, and because of there being no risk, there was no incentive for PKers to hunt here other than griefing. Jagex actually wouldn't fix this mistake until 21 and a half years later in Old School. Also of note is the date of release. This update was literally the very next day after the Shilo Village update. No, it's not a mistake. We just got multiple major content updates in the same week. We're lucky if we get 2 updates of this magnitude in a single quarter of the year today, let alone twice in the same week. However, you'll probably notice the updates really start to slow down for the rest of the year and eventually stop altogether, as Jagex was mainly focused on the entire game in 3D for RuneScape 2's launch. March 3rd, 2003. Just a week and a half after American pop singer Olivia Rodrigo was born, Jagex took us to an even darker place than she did with her first album, Sour, with the release of the Underground Pass. This is one of those regions of the map that, even today in Old School, still somehow looks straight out of Classic. This is going to be a recurring theme this year because Jagex was concurrently releasing updates for most of 2003 while also immediately remaking them for re-release in early 2004 upon the launch of RuneScape 2. As such, a lot of the 2003 and even some of the late 2002 updates, even still today, feel so much older than some updates released far earlier on. That's why I love visiting clunky places like Shilo Village and Legends Quest Dungeon, because they still have that nostalgic feel, and I hope they leave them alone forever for that reason. Now, we've already talked about this quest and area quite a few times on this channel, so as a brief summary for the uninitiated, this cavern below the impassable mountain terrain, known as the Galarpos Mountains, acts as a dangerous below-ground mountain pass filled with all sorts of dangers like booby traps, monsters, and seemingly impossible agility obstacles. During the appropriately named Underground Pass quest, we had to make our way from the entrance in West Ardougne all the way to the very back, which would one day lead us to the then unreleased Elflands via the Well of Voyage. The most memorable and most frustrating part of this quest was probably constantly failing the agility obstacles many miles away from a bank to restock on food and other crucial supplies. So, while this wasn't an update to the surface of the map, the many miles away from the bank would suggest that this really was a massive new area. As we've mentioned before, there were obviously no quest guides upon release, so every time you discovered that a new item was needed to traverse further into the dungeon, or if you had to restock on food, you had to turn around and double back after obtaining the necessary item, leaving you with one fewer crucial inventory slot for food each time. Or, if you brought teleport runes to save time on the way out, that was another 2 or 3 inventory slots wasted on anything but food and potions. And don't forget that in Classic, armor and weapons were worn straight out of the inventory, not a separate equipment menu, and there was no home teleport spell. Inventory space was at a premium when you really needed it the most, and more likely than not, you would have died a few times and lost all of your stuff while trying to complete this quest, having to gather it all again and again. No doubt, the lead developer of the quest, Mod Tom, had a bet going with his colleagues at Jagex about how long it would take for the first players to successfully complete the quest. Needless to say, they probably owed him a lot of drinks at the pub by the end of the week. March 17th, 2003. St. Paddy's Day once again. The developers of the Observatory quest must have already been drunk when they decided to name the main character of this quest Professor Mambo Duna Runa Groningen. No, seriously, that's his real name in the game according to his assistant. Of course, with this update, we also saw the release of the Observatory and its dungeon, but we also got our first exposure to the constellations. I'm sure many of us thought this was just some obscure RuneScape lore until meeting that crazy girl from the internet in the distant future and finding out people actually believe this crap means something. Imagine excitedly telling her that you once met one of the constellation's spirits at the then new Graveyard of Scorpius in-game. This part of the update doesn't have much significance today, but back then, it was still pretty important in that the Spirit of Scorpius has the ability to bless the new, player-suggested, unholy symbols, the antithesis of holy symbols. In Classic, an unholy symbol gave a single point stat bonus in aim, power, and armor, alongside a +6 prayer bonus, compared to the otherwise statless holy symbol with a +8 prayer bonus. In Old School today, they both give +8 prayer bonus, but the holy symbol gives +2 bonus to all defensive stats, and the unholy symbol gives +2 bonus to all offensive stats. Pretty useful in context. While this update blurred the lines between religion and pseudoscience, it wouldn't be until the date of our next update when we would see some real science. April 14th, 2003. On this very date, Human Genome Project completed its work sequencing 99% of the human genome. However, there was one far more important ongoing development. If you lived in North America, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker had just been released by Nintendo. Without this game, we wouldn't have half of the non-RuneScape music used in old school RuneScape videos on YouTube. It really seems to be every content creator's favorite soundtrack. You know, I don't know what it is, but there's just something about the cheery, peaceful, and hopeful Outset Island theme that works so well with brutal player killing in PvP.
Bro. No shot.
As long as we're already talking about things in RuneScape trying to kill you, we also saw yet another map expansion on this date with the release of the Kharidian Desert. You know, the one place in game where the environment itself actively tries to kill you via severe dehydration. There really wasn't much to do here besides the tourist trap quest, so X-Rakeen would probably have finished his Deserted series in just a matter of hours if he tried it in Classic. You know, that 1% of the human genome that went unsequenced must have included the gene for having the propensity for torturing oneself by making a snowflake Iron Man with brutal restrictions and overly ambitious goals. If they had sequenced that gene, the scientists involved may have killed the project right then and there. About 2 weeks after this update, we did see the release of a project that would eventually get killed, unfortunately. Although the show previously existed in another form, April 28th was the first time the video game review show X-Play aired under its iconic name and with its two most famous hosts together, Adam Sessler and Morgan Webb, a couple of living legends. Speaking of legendary performances, May 7th, 2003. Arsenal began what would go on to become their 49-match unbeaten streak on their way to their last Premier League championship. Unfortunately, I didn't have as much fortune as I found myself getting one-shot by an unexpected blue dragon when I didn't know that I needed my anti-dragon shield during the Watchtower quest, also released on this date. Death carried a very heavy price in Classic, so the odds of retrieving your gear in 2 minutes on the other side of the map from Lumbridge, which had no bank, to an area that requires specific quest items to access, were essentially zero. And those quest areas were so off the beaten path that the odds of anyone being able to recover your gear were slim as well. And even if someone did recover your gear, you know they would just keep it for themselves, as I would go on to learn the hard way here. But with that quest also came the release of the Ogre City of Gu'Tanoth, as well as an expansion of Feldip Hills, including the infamous Death Rune spawn surrounded by wolves that never lose aggression, maybe thwarting some less sophisticated bots from camping a spawn. World hopping wasn't much of a thing back then prior to the release of SwiftKit or Swift Switch for RuneScape 2. So, if you wanted these death runes, you had to camp out one world and just pick up the death rune each time it spawned. Unfortunately, this really was one of the best, most reliable ways to obtain your own death runes in the entire game besides buying them. And before you guess that trading cats for death runes would be better, they hadn't been released just yet, but upon release could only be traded for 25 death runes in West Ardougne rather than 100 or 200 today. You can tell a lot of runecrafting haters in Old School never played Classic, because if they had, they would really appreciate the skill making it possible to reliably acquire these previously rare runes. June 9th, 2003. Earlier we mentioned a team who wears red and hasn't won any championships in over 20 years, but they aren't the only one. The NHL's New Jersey Devils won their last ever Stanley Cup on this date. Led by goalie Marty Brodeur, who even pitched a cup-clinching shutout, successfully waffleboarding away all 24 shots on net. This Game 7 finished with the Anaheim Mighty Ducks getting killed 3-0, but that wasn't the murder we were interested in investigating on this date. In RuneScape, we saw the release of the Murder Mystery Quest, and therefore, a map expansion of the Sinclair Mansion, the perfect quest for your friend who's so much of a true crime junkie that they're really excited when summoned for jury duty. Here we had to pretend to be Hercule Poirot and investigate the murder of Lord Sinclair. After collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses, we put all the pieces together and came to the conclusion that it had to be one of his children. Although there was a lot of evidence incriminating all of the children, in fact, it was none other than the oldest son, Bob. Or maybe it was really Anna, and she framed her younger brother. Or maybe they were all in on it together. It's hard to blame the Sinclair children when their father started with the letter A when naming his first child and moved down a letter of the alphabet every time he wanted to choose a new name for a new child. It really makes you wonder if he also fathered another 20 illegitimate children to flesh out the rest of the alphabet, including the victim of the Draynor bank robbery, a nearly identical sibling who only shows up around the holidays, and the last one who hated her family so much that she moved far away to be an herbalist in Narda. The very next day after this murder mystery update, NASA launched its Spirit rover to study the Martian planet, Mars. The rover notably discovered some rocks that had been previously modified by water, suggesting that the planet may have once been home to water, and therefore, perhaps even life. Alien life? July 9th, 2003. Just 5 days before the United States finally admitted that Area 51 really exists. You know, that place where a bunch of feeble, meme-spamming anime nerds who are normally too afraid to ask for more ketchup for their tendies decided to organize a mass event to Naruto run past the US military with the desperate hopes of clapping some alien cheeks back in 2019. The extent of their plan for the raid was literally just, they can't stop all of us. Unfortunately, because it was a public Facebook event, the government had more than enough time and notice to move all of the aliens to Area 52 until the wannabe trespassers decided they had enough sunlight for that decade and all went home, probably needing to catch up on dozens of new episodes of One Piece that probably released in the mere 48 hours they were away from home. Anyway, maybe Jagex should use this raid as inspiration for Raids 4 in Old School that they hinted toward at RuneFest earlier this year. So, while that nonsense may have been a major public discovery if they had been successful, we actually made a much more substantial discovery of another ancient civilization and their god during RuneScape's groundbreaking Dig Site quest. As the name of the quest would suggest, the world map, of course, saw the release of the Dig Site and its exam center, as well as some areas below ground infested by spooky, scary skeletons. This was our first real evidence of the existence of Zeros and how Zamorak had used the Staff of Armadil to switch places with him. July 28th, 2003. Speaking of switching places, the world was about to see the release of the completely original film, Freaky Friday, the following week. No wait, not that version, the remake. No wait, not that remake, the older remake. No, the one with Lindsay Lohan. No, the prequel to that one. There we go. Anyway, as I was saying, this was a completely original movie idea that's never been done before. After some rough years in her career, I'm just glad that Lindsay Lohan was able to turn her life around, starring in a couple of Hallmark tier Christmas movies in previous years. At least her acting career is doing a lot better than her British twin sister's career. I haven't seen her in anything since The Parent Trap, and that movie is even older than RuneScape. Now, this date also saw the release of the pre-construction skill Lumberyard and Gertrude's house, as well as the ability to have your own pet cat. Gertrude Fairweather was the supposedly married but de facto single mom, crazy cat lady neighbor whose 4 kids probably have 4 different dads, since her husband, Walter Fairweather, travels for work for 20 plus years at a time, apparently. The introduction of pet cats and Gertrude's lack of loyalty begs the question, where are the pet dogs? They're the bravest and most fiercely loyal of all pets. My sausage dog fears nothing but the bins on trash pickup day, and it would be nice to have an equally loyal and brave companion to join us in-game. In the RuneScape 3 timeline, we didn't get pet dogs until the release of the summoning skill in January 2008. But in Old School, we have yet to get any pet dogs unless you count the Hell Puppy or Bloodhound. There was a Game Jam proposal 3 years ago addressing this erroneous omission from the game, but nothing ever came of it, unfortunately. However, rest assured that one day we will get them, and that day will be legendary. There was also one last small map update worth pointing out on this date as well. Just west of Tutorial Island, you can see 2 identical pairs of ships. That's because this date also saw the release of the game's 3rd ever minigame, the Fishing Trawler. Since there were no true instances in Classic, Jagex improvised by placing 4, but really only 2, fishing trawlers on every world. One ship for the first half of the game, and the other for when it takes on water at the end. I think Jagex significantly overestimated how popular the minigame would be, especially since a relatively high fishing level was required to even benefit from the only unique rewards of high healing manta rays and sea turtles. What Jagex significantly underestimated was how dedicated their most legendary players would be to RuneScape as a whole. August 20th, 2003. As RuneScape Classic drew to a close, it seems appropriate to reflect back on the legends who helped to shape the game. Rab, RuneScape's first ever player. Blue Rose 13X, the first to level 99 magic and level 99 smithing, single-handedly made all of the earliest adamant and rune items. CKS, the first to 99 fishing and cooking. Latangel, the first to 99 crafting, who crafted many of the higher level jewelry items for us. The Old Knight, a humble, rank number 1 overall, who had no problem striking up a conversation with anyone, and just the second player to eventually reach level 99 in all skills. Zezima, another one of the early game's top players, and the first to reach level 99 in all skills eventually, whom many of us would consider to be the greatest RuneScape player of all time. It only seems fitting that the 50th and final quest in RuneScape Classic would be dedicated to them, and give each of us the opportunity to feel like we too could join these legends with the release of the Legends quest. This quest was actually incredibly difficult at the time, not just because of the skill requirements, but also because of the unique dangers of the boss fights, but more on that later. With the release of this quest, the map expanded once again with the Karazi jungle above ground and the Vieldi caves just below that. These dangerous new areas, home to these Estonian chickens, were only able to be reached by the game's very best and most skilled players. And much like other contemporary areas in the game, these places were being developed concurrently in both RuneScape Classic and RuneScape 2, generally around the same time. It's why these places never quite got the same graphical overhaul that other places received upon the migration to RuneScape 2, and why they've been mostly untouched after over 20 years. Those brave enough and strong enough to venture to these new areas could find themselves rewarded with a new best-in-slot shield and best-in-slot cape, not only for defense, but far more importantly, for fashionscape. One interesting feature in the caves that gets overlooked on most playthroughs would have to be these strange barrels that can spawn all sorts of random foes and items. It begs the question how these creatures fit into these barrels and how they survive without food and water in this isolated room deep into a dungeon that only the most skilled can traverse. Like, how does a level 6 mugger, for example, get in here past all of the skill checks on the way in? The only explanation is that these barrels are magic and teleport random enemies and items from all over the map to you. One of the possible enemies that can spawn is a Dark Wizard, the notorious killer of noobs south of Varrock. Wouldn't it be amusing if these barrels could be collected and opened anywhere so that Dark Wizards could pick off bots anywhere if you get lucky enough with your RNG? What's also interesting is the certificate drop table of the barrels. Once again, this is one of those relics of RuneScape Classic still in the game today because it never got fixed back in March 2004, or ever again for that matter. I hope they never update these old places as a proper relic of days gone by. But speaking of relics of days gone by, September 22nd, 2003. This fall saw the release of some iconic classic Flash animations like Badger Badger Mushroom, The End of the World, 55, and Clayworld by Nox. This was really the beginning of the era of Newgrounds, E-Bombs World, Albino Black Sheep, and plenty of other non-centralized, nostalgic websites that preceded the consolidation of videos on YouTube. But while one era began, another came to an end. Jagex released its final true map update of RuneScape Classic, with the Mage Arena. That's right, this would be both the final version of the game and the final version of this world map until RuneScape Classic eventually shut down. Those brave enough to venture to the deepest depths of the wilderness and who had achieved a daunting level 60 magic could battle it out here to earn another best-in-slot cape for Magic, and arguably for Fashionscape as well, if you couldn't cut it as a legend. Many of you may recognize this update as the final content update of RuneScape Classic, besides Halloween and the Scythe, and therefore, the final world map. And you'd technically be correct. However, I would argue we actually had at least one more map update to RuneScape Classic. August 6th, 2018. Europe and the UK were at the tail end of a brutal, deadly heat wave. In the UK, temperatures reached a peak of 35 degrees Celsius, or 96 degrees in freedom units, alongside up to 100% humidity. That may not sound out of the ordinary for those of you in the American South or Australian Outback, but they don't exactly have much in the way of infrastructure to handle temperatures or humidity like that in Europe. Europeans mostly lack air conditioning and also lack the necessary power grid to support its widespread use anyway. It makes you wonder why they don't invest more in nuclear energy. They even lack other essentials to beat the heat, like proper lemonade or iced tea in the American South, or cool blue flavored Pop Tops from Woolies in Australia. How was anyone expected to survive weather like that without those crucial beverages? The very thought of a cold beverage probably triggers the average Brit to put on the kettle instinctively. As such, sacrifices had to be made to lower the heat. Jagex even had to make the difficult decision to literally pull the plug on their last remaining RuneScape Classic servers to help lower the heat in their office and beyond. Well, it must have worked because the UK's heat wave, and this is true, came to an end quite literally the very next day. It turns out that it uses a lot of power to run a bunch of bot accounts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Coincidence? I think not. Unfortunately, while that's all mostly true, the real story of our final update to the RuneScape Classic world map, if you even want to call it that, is a bit sadder than that of a noble sacrifice. The few real players who remained couldn't justify to Jagex the cost of keeping the servers going. At the same time, there were game-breaking bugs like permanently breaking the crystal chest in Taverley and security vulnerabilities like PID swapping. Also, most of the players online were just bots running 24/7 with impunity. Well, it turns out that no one left at Jagex in 2018 had any idea how any of this ancient spaghetti code worked, and there wasn't really much value in anyone trying to learn it at this point. You know, this may come as a surprise to many of you because of my Great Lakes accent, but my dad is actually Jagex. It's often difficult to get his attention in a magnificent game because he's lost in wonder. We were playing RuneScape Classic together years ago, and I asked him what it would cost to fix the broken spaghetti code today, and I'll never forget his answer. We can't. We don't know how to do it. As such, Jagex gave us about 3 months notice that they were just going to shut the game down for good. And they did shut it down. Scheduled for 8 AM on August the 6th. A bunch of us old-timers gathered together one last time in the game to see it off properly. I'm sure many of you watching this were even there with me in Draynor Village that day, trading original or maybe even duplicated, discontinued holiday items and other rares. In fact, that's me right there. But not all of us were there in Draynor Village. Deep within the treacherous and savage jungles of Karamja, Witch streamer Titus Furious was in a race against the clock. He had started a goal to complete all quests on his original Classic account, and so far, he had completed 49 out of 50, with only the Legends quest left to complete before the server shut down. Keep in mind, this quest might be relatively easy by today's standards in Old School, but this quest was actually extremely long and incredibly difficult in Classic. It was almost impossible to pray melee or eat against the demon, and you had to beat him in a fight numerous times. And don't forget that death carried a heavy price in Classic, especially this far from any teleports. Any death could permanently end the run, and unfortunately, Titus fell victim to the demon Nezakined. 8 AM was quickly approaching in the UK, and Titus was close, but not close enough to finishing the quest. The clock hit 0 on the shutdown, with about 15 to 20 minutes left in the quest. It was now 8 AM. It was too late. He didn't make it. But then, a miracle happened. Jagex caught wind of this one final effort, and actually delayed the shutdown just for him. Jagex gave Titus just enough time to take another shot at it. The RuneScape Classic community was closely watching and quickly rallied to resupply him. He returned to the Karazi jungle and slayed the Scourge of the Jungle. The madman actually did it, and the community celebrated accordingly. It took 15 years, but Titus became a true legend that day, and even made the news for it. The last and final legend of RuneScape Classic. Eventually, the celebrations ended, as the end of the world was finally upon us. A 17-and-a-half-year journey in this world finally came to an end, and we got the very last update to this version of the world map. Xaners came crashing down to destroy the world, and the remnants must have been sucked into Thorder's black hole, because everything and everyone got permanently banned that day. And there we have it. The final map of RuneScape Classic. A desolate, barren void, frozen in time forever. But our story doesn't have to end there. Let's rewind time 14 and a half years to March 2004 and start on a new branch of the RuneScape timeline. The next update on this new branch would be the largest and arguably most important world map update of all time, with the transformation of the entire world map and also some new in-game content that surprised even Jagex. Be sure to subscribe so you can find out all about this and more in the next episode as we move on to RuneScape 2.